Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 24, April 1917. Do you suppose we'll get American patients? Nurse Crawley asked, unspooling the tape measure as she walked backwards toward the opposite wall. Don't know, Thomas admitted. The United States had recently declared war on Germany, getting everyone's hopes up for a quick victory. I expect this is just about the normal spring offensives, though. Major Clarkson had been ordered to produce a report on how many additional patients the hospital might manage to accommodate. He and Nurse Crawley, in turn, had been ordered to measure the day rooms and other spaces that could be converted into wards. It'll be ages before any Americans even get to France. Well, yes, but when they do, I mean, Nurse Crawley said. That's 36 feet. Thomas noted it down. I expect they'll bring their own medical corps with them, he said, giving more thought to her question. But they'll need somewhere to put them, away from the fighting, but not across the whole ocean. Might bring them here, I suppose. To England, at any rate, though a cottage hospital in a small village in Yorkshire likely wouldn't be the first place they thought of. Though if they want us to take many, we're going to have to put army huts on the green. Granny would love that, she observed, going to measure the other dimension of the room. They're a good bit easier to work in, Thomas said. This place, built before anyone had heard of germs, had all sorts of decorative flourishes that were hard to keep clean, and the scullery and sink room were badly located and smaller than they should have been. But I imagine if the army were to put up hospital huts in villages, they'd start closer to the channel. I suppose so, Nurse Crawley said. 64 feet. Once they had finished the measurements, Thomas went outside for a cigarette around the back of the hospital. Now that the spring weather had arrived, the patients sat out front on fine days. A moment or two later, Nurse Crawley joined him. She looked expectantly at him, and he wordlessly passed her his cigarette case and lighter. Thank you, she said, selecting a cigarette. As she handed the case back, she asked casually, Is it your sweetheart, the one who was killed? Thomas choked on his smoke. He'd momentarily forgotten about the picture. A good thing in the abstract, he supposed, since he'd started carrying the case again in an effort to stop it being an object of superstitious dread, but not at all a good thing in the particular. Nurse Crawley hopefully thumped him on the back. Oh, you're all right? Yes, he managed and coughed again. He's my brother. I know, she said. You said that so you'd be notified. Fuck me blinds! Who told you about that? Mary, she said. Or maybe it was Anna? She considered for a moment. Oh, now I remember. They talked about it in front of me. This just got worse and worse. Both Lady Mary and Lady Sybil knew. Was there anyone in the house who didn't? I'm sorry they troubled you with that, Thomas said stiffly. Oh, I don't mind that you're a homosexual, she said much too loudly. Keep your voice down, Thomas snapped. She drew back a little. I'm sorry, he said, but it's not meant to be public knowledge. I could get in a lot of trouble. I'm the one who should apologize, she said. It's very sad that you could get in trouble just for being in love with the wrong person. That wasn't precisely what he'd be in trouble for, but the last thing Thomas wanted was to be asked to explain precisely what constituted an act of gross indecency. It's all right. Just be careful what you say about it, and to whom, and where, and at what volume. I will, she promised. A moment later, she said, quietly, I don't suppose any of us can help who we fall in love with, can we? Even if it's someone that might be thought completely unsuitable. No, I suppose not, he said. Was she hinting that she was in love with someone unsuitable? Mentally reviewing what he'd seen of her with the patients and orderlies, and the other VADs for good measure, he couldn't come up with any obvious candidates. It wasn't any of his business, in any case, and no good would come of his knowing. If there was something going on that shouldn't be, he might be considered to have a duty to report it to Sister Crawley if he knew about it. Unfortunately, Nurse Crawley was not struck by a similar impulse to mind her own business. How did you... she began, and then hesitated long enough for Thomas to become truly worried about what she was going to ask. It was something of a relief when she finished. Decide that it was worth it, I mean. She was in love with someone unsuitable, all right, or thought she was at any rate. There wasn't really anything to decide. You mean you just knew? What a world she lived in.
I mean, it wasn't as though we could get married, or even set up house together. Nor was either of us going to fall in love with someone more suitable.
Oh, yes, I see, she said.
But after the war, couldn't you? I don't really want to talk about what we thought we'd do after the war, Thomas interrupted. He could just about stand talking about it with Rouse, who knew all the reasons it had been impossible, but he couldn't possibly bear trying to explain to Lady Sybil why they hadn't just run away together. If you don't mind.
Of course, she said. I shouldn't have pried. I'm sure the subject is still painful.
At least she understood that much. It is, he said, tossing down his cigarette, and I'd best be getting back to work.
Fortunately, she didn't raise the subject again as they walked back to Downton Abbey. Now that it was spring, the walk was made in twilight, and the danger of highwaymen even more remote, but they still usually walked together. When he let himself in at the kitchen door, Thomas saw Carson, of all people, carrying the main course up to the dining room, followed by Anna with a sauce. Sitting down next to Bates in the servants' hall, he asked, "Something happened to William?" Bates explained, "His call-up papers came in the Morning Post." Noting in the back of his mind that someone had better look in on Daisy, Thomas said, "And he's gone already? Did the post office misplace the letter?" Surely he'd not have been ordered to report that very day. Bates looked at him with an expression that might have been pity. "He went home to spend his last few days with his father." Oh, of course that was something people did.
"Right," Thomas said. To cover the lapse, he added, "I don't suppose they'd insist on notice in the circumstances." "Mr. Carson had a bit of a grumble about it, but it wasn't as though he could tell them not to go," Bates said. When the upstairs dinner was finished and Anna came in, Thomas asked her how Daisy was holding up.
"She's all right, I think," Anna answered. "Miss Patmore seems to be taking it harder for some reason."
That was distinctly odd, but as Daisy brought in their dinner, she did seem all right. A bit withdrawn, perhaps. Later, he was out smoking his after-dinner cigarette when she came out with a bowl of scraps to throw away. "Doing all right?" he asked her. She slammed the lid on the bin.
"I wish everyone would stop asking!"
"Sorry," Thomas said, flicking ash from his cigarette. She sighed and sat down on a crate near to his, holding the empty scrap bowl in her hands.
"He asked me for a photograph to take with him."
Thomas nodded, taking a drag from his cigarette. Of course he had. They'd been walking out for years now.
"I like William," she went on. "I mean, everyone likes William, but I'm not sure we're proper sweethearts. Not to me."
"Oh," he raised an eyebrow.
"It's been fun," she said, "walking out with him. But I think that's more, well, just walking out with someone. He's the only man I see regularly, our age, I mean. And he's nice and has a good job, and I should count myself lucky, really, but—"
It was hard for Thomas to find much sympathy. He wanted to point out to her that at least they could walk out, but he could just about manage to see how it was a difficult problem.
"But I can hardly tell him now that I'd like us to just be friends," she finished.
"Not the best time for it," Thomas agreed.
"I was hoping you wouldn't get called up after all," she admitted, "with the Americans and everything, and then we could just sort of stop, gradual-like."
"It's only a photograph," Thomas pointed out. "It isn't as though you're promising him anything, technically." She bit her lip.
"No, but—"
"He won't expect you to do anything more than write to him," Thomas said, not like what's-her-name and her undergardener. "And I suppose you would, anyway, as a friend."
"But I can't write him love letters. Not if I'm not in love with him."
William didn't strike Thomas as likely to write a lot of sappy stuff. But then Thomas had no way of knowing how William in love might behave. "I expect you can get away with keeping it light and chatty. Downton gossip, that sort of thing." The sort of thing Anna had written to him. The sort of thing he had written to Peter. He went on. "But if you don't think you can keep it up, it's not a good time to break it off, but from here it's going to get worse before it gets better. At training, they'll keep him too busy to fret about it much. He stopped abruptly. Nearly everyone at the house knew, but he wasn't sure if Daisy did.
But she nodded. "It took your mind off things, like?"
"Yes," Thomas said and hurried on. "But getting a dear John at the front, that's pretty rough. Everything's already so grim and depressing. At least now. Well, unless he's come to his senses in the last few hours, he's still excited about going."
Daisy nodded, looking brighter. He is. He said he hopes they don't win it before he gets there. Her face fell. But everyone else knows he shouldn't be. They'll think I'm a cold-hearted witch if I break his heart right before he goes off to war. She had a point.
I don't see any way around that, he said, apart from letting him go on thinking you're sweethearts.
Daisy sighed dejectedly. She's talking to Thomas, Anna reported to Miss Patmore, who'd been carrying on for the last several minutes about where that girl could have gotten to. Best give them a few minutes, she advised. I expect he understands best what she's going through.
What she's going through, Miss Patmore said, is what poor William will be going through that I'm thinking about.
He knows about that too, she pointed out. Within a few minutes, Daisy had come back inside, and Thomas as well. As they went back to the servants' hall, Anna raised the subject of what poor William would soon be going through, and was heartened to hear Thomas say,
It's possible it won't be so bad with the Yanks coming in. Maybe they'll decide to let them take the brunt of this year's offensives.
You think so? Anna asked, taking her seat.
It's possible, Thomas repeated. Just as likely they'll try the 1st of July all over again in hopes of making a big breakthrough before the Americans come and snatch all the glory.
Oh, said Anna. Thomas went on to explain that the War Office had instructed them to make room for more patients at the hospital.
The only way we'll manage it is by eliminating the day rooms and shipping them off to Farley Hall as soon as they're able to get out of bed. Could be just be general planning ahead. Could be they've something planned that they expect heavy casualties.
Anna shifted the subject. Mr. Matthew's going to be out of it for a bit. They were talking about it at dinner. He's touring Yorkshire with a general for some reason.
Lucky old him, Thomas said. They going to be looking in at the hospital?
They didn't say, but he'll be here in about 2 weeks. They're planning a dinner.
Without a footman, Thomas said. Carson's going to love that.
Ethel, who'd been eavesdropping, packed up. We could disguise ourselves as men. Strap up ourselves down and hide our hair under our collars and livery. I bet no one will notice.
Anna and Thomas exchanged a look, and he said, Somehow I think Mr. Carson would find that even worse than having maids in the dining room in dresses.
Will you do it then? Ethel asked. I expect the hospital would have to let you off for the evening if they asked.
Anna thought she was probably right. It wouldn't be exactly proper, but it would be hard for Dr. Clarkson to say no, and surely he could manage something even with his shoulder the way it was. Thomas, however, said, He's going to be spoiled for choice, isn't he? Maids? Cross-dressed maids? Or me? I don't know how he'll decide.
Despite what Thomas had said to Anna and the others, he was a little worried that Carson would want him in the dining room for the big occasion. Well, want was certainly too strong of a word, but he might just decide that Thomas was a less appalling option than the alternatives. And then Thomas would have to show him that he couldn't carry trays in his left hand, and then... Well, Thomas wasn't sure what would happen next, but he didn't want to find out. That worry, however, was pushed to the back of his mind by developments at the hospital, nearly as soon as Major Clarkson had submitted his report, which stressed how inconvenient it would be to squeeze in any more wards. They received orders to do just that. So, in addition to all their other work, they had to set up the day rooms as wards and deal with the increased demands of gentlemen confined to their beds when they would have been well enough to venture into the next room to read the newspaper or have a game of cards, had there been a room for them to do it in. They were also allocated a few new VADs and orderlies, which would be a help in the long run, but for right now, training them was just more extra work. Thomas was utterly unsurprised when, a couple of days later, the papers brought news of a big push in northern France. He was, however, a little surprised to return to the house that evening and find a new face downstairs. Or rather, a face that was not completely new, although Thomas couldn't place him at first. A man a bit older than he was, quite thin, and something in the back of Thomas's mind didn't expect to see him in livery. It wasn't until he caught sight of Thomas and startled violently enough to rattle the dishes on the tray he was bringing down that Thomas placed him. The CCS the previous winter. Stammer, battle dreams, bouts of weepiness. Thomas had had him on a work crew for a bit, and he'd mentioned having been in service before the war. Valid, Thomas thought. Lying, isn't it? He asked, reaching out to steady the tray.
Yes, Corporal,
he said automatically. No trace of the stammer, at least.
Oh, it's Henry, here. Henry, he repeated. He seemed to have the tray under control now, so Thomas released it. Best get on before Mr. Carson has a fit, he said. We can talk after dinner if you'd like. For one thing, Thomas would have to find out what Lang had told them about his military service and how he gotten out. Right, said Henry Lang. Best get on, he echoed. Thomas continued to the servants' hall, where Anna filled him in on what was known about the new arrival. His lordship had gone down to London to inquire at the placement agencies about a footman, and given the limited selection, had hired Henry Lang on the spot. He was invalided out of the army, Bates added. Apparently the doctors recommended he try working in the country. Thomas was not entirely sure that working under Carson was precisely what they'd had in mind. I see, he said. Well, he's come just in time to spare Mr. Carson from dying of shame, so let's hope he's grateful. But when they came into the servants' hall, Carson puffing like a railway engine and Lang scuttling after him like a crab caught short by the ebbing tide, it didn't seem likely. And when they all sat down and Carson launched into what sounded like the second half of a lecture about how things were done at Downton Abbey, it became absolutely clear that he wasn't. For a while, Thomas was torn between being glad someone else was on the receiving end of Carson's disapprobation, for a change, and feeling sorry for the poor bastard. But as Lang's head sank between his shoulders, the scales tipped decidedly in favor of the latter, and when his hands started to shake, his fork rattling against the plate, Thomas didn't think he could stand it much longer. He would have tried saying something to Lang first, but Lang was seated across the table between Miss O'Brien and Ethel, and anything Thomas tried to say to him would be heard by everyone else. Sometimes you just had to throw yourself onto the grenade. Mr. Carson, Thomas said, interrupting him mid-tirade, I'd like to speak to you after dinner, if that's convenient. Carson turned an incredulous look on him, and Thomas rather wished he'd left Lang to his own devices. About what, may I ask? You may, said Thomas. After dinner. Across the table, Lang was watching him warily, and Thomas attempted to shrug in a reassuring manner. Later, as the meal was being cleared, and after Mr. Carson had left, Lang scuttled around the table to Thomas's side, slipping into the place that Anna had vacated between him and Bates. Colonel, that is Lord Grantham, knows why I was discharged from the army, he said. That's probably for the best, Thomas said. It didn't seem likely that Lang could keep it a secret for long, and it would be fairly difficult to say what he had in mind to Mr. Carson if it was supposed to be a secret. Thought they sent you back up to the front, though. They did, said Lang. I suffered a relapse. I got that happens a lot. Thomas tried to remember if Lang had been there at the same time as Kingston, or the poor bastard who shot himself in the foot. He wasn't sure. I caught a packet at the Somme, he said. Shoulder. Now I'm working at the hospital in the village. Lang nodded. One of the others said. Miss O'Brien, I think. So O'Brien had her hooks in him already. Word of advice, Thomas said. If she tells you she can get Bates fired and make you valet, she's lying. Bates, on Lang's other side, coughed. Thomas glanced at him. And once I've left the room, Mr. Bates will warn you about me, if he hasn't already. I don't need to wait, Bates said. If she did manage to get rid of me, you'd have to fight Thomas for it. That wasn't precisely the warning that Thomas had had in mind, but he said, If the war's ended by then, yeah, I might stab you in the throat with a rusty knife. But until then, we might as well be mates. And now you know as much as you need to know about Thomas, Bates said. Well, nearly, anyway, Lang said. We've met, as a matter of fact. In France, Thomas added, because if Lang went around being mysterious about their acquaintance, everyone was sure to get the wrong idea. Corporal Barrow was at the hospital where I was treated, Lang said. He took a deep breath. For shell shock. Bates, to his credit, didn't react beyond a nod. Minor leg wound, he said. But from the South African War, I served under Lord Grantham there. That's why he was kind enough to give me the job, even though I can't wait at table when there's a need. Now that was a sharp bit of maneuvering. If Lang was thinking that his lordship had hired him out of pity, which to be honest he probably had, at least he knew he wasn't the only one. And nobody's really sure what I'm doing back here, he added. He moved on. Do you know if his lordship's explained to Mr. Carson about your discharge? Lang hesitated. I don't know. I hoped he wouldn't have to. That didn't seem at all likely. If Carson knows that his lordship is aware of the situation and has decided it's for the best, he won't go against him. Thomas and Bates were both living proof of that. Carson had even seemed to be making a bit of an effort lately to keep his feelings about Thomas's presence in the house to himself. Also, I'm sure someone will tell you soon enough why it's not a good idea to keep Carson in the dark about how we know each other. Left to his own devices, the conclusion he'll come to is even worse.
What?
Lang began, but he clammed up at a slight shake of Bates's head.
Not here.
Bates said. Don't worry, Thomas added. We're all extremely good at knowing things and not talking about them. Not long after that, Carson came back down from fetching the coffee things from upstairs, and Thomas went to beard the dragon in his den. He was a little relieved to hear Miss Hughes's voice from inside the half-open door to the butler's pantry.
Don't think it was wrong, listen to ask.
Thomas suspected they were discussing the very subject he'd come to broach, and would have liked to keep listening long enough to confirm it, but it wouldn't help matters at all to be caught eavesdropping. He knocked briskly on the door frame.
What?
Carson demanded. With a mental prayer that Miss Hughes wouldn't desert the field, he went in. Is this a good time, Mr. Carson?
Not particularly,
said Carson, biting off each word. Doing his best impression of Sister Crawley as amiable steamroller, Thomas went on, because I thought I might be able to fill in a few gaps about Lang. Henry, he corrected himself. Miss Hughes said quickly,
His lordship has just been explaining to Mr. Carson that we must be patient.
Oh, good. I was going to suggest you speak to him on the subject, Thomas said smoothly. Miss Hughes, you may remember last winter, I was working at the... He paused to choose his words. Special hospital.
I do,
Miss Hughes said. As it happens, Henry, was there at the time. He was on one of my work crews. In fact, decent enough worker, even at the height of his difficulties. The thing is, with blokes like that, if you draw attention to their difficulties, it only makes matters worse. If they're carrying on as best they can, and Lang's the sort to try, it's best just to pretend nothing's amiss.
Well, that certainly makes sense,
Miss Hughes put in.
You wouldn't want a fuss if you were having troubles,
she told Carson. Carson rumbled his displeasure at Thomas guessed the prospect that he might be capable of having troubles. Recovering enough to produce actual words, he said,
If he isn't well enough to work, I'm not sure what he was doing at an employment agency.
I expect he needs to work, Thomas said. It was difficult enough getting a discharge for nervous troubles, let alone a pension. And it's meant to be the best thing for them, working. Despite the failure of the treatment methods Thomas had observed at the 14th Casualty Clearing Station, he'd read in one of Major Clarkson's RAMC medical journals that similar centers had been set up throughout the British section of the front. Having nothing to occupy them makes it worse.
Even so, it doesn't need to work. Sure,
Carson grumbled. I can't imagine there's too many would-be footmen to choose from at the moment, Thomas pointed out. And he's got to be a more convincing footman than Ethel in trousers. Carson sputtered, and even Miss Hughes said reprovingly,
Thomas!
She volunteered for it, Thomas said with a shrug. Might have been a joke. I'm not sure. At any rate, you're not going to get a healthy man. We're not even getting them in the RAMC. You can't use anyone with a limb wound or anyone who's blind or deaf. You could have a man who's been gassed, coughing his lungs out in the dining room, or one with a facial injury that people won't want to look at while they're eating. If you don't fancy that, you're pretty much left with shell shock. All maids in the dining room. Take your pick. Thomas thought that might be a good note on which to make his exit, but Carson was eyeing him speculatively.
You could manage in the dining room, he said, without making yourself conspicuous.
He really couldn't, but with Lang in the picture, he didn't have to explain why not. And I'm still in the army.
Is the new footman settling in all right?
Robert asked as Bates divested him of his cufflinks. Bates glanced at him.
I believe so, my lord. I take it he's a bit out of practice when it comes to waiting at table.
Robert held in a sigh. Carson had wasted no time after dinner in confronting him with an enumeration of the poor blighter's errors, most of which had been barely noticeable.
He had a difficult war.
I gathered as much, my lord. It seems Thomas knows him from France.
Robert gave him a sharp look. If they were particular friends, that would be another mark against Henry in Carson's books.
It was a patient at the casualty clearing station where they had Thomas working last winter,"
Bates explained.
"Apparently he was treated and sent back to the front, but then had a relapse."
How ghastly! He didn't go into that much detail, Robert said. I must say, he seemed steadier when I met him in London, but I suppose most people are nervous in a new position.
Really, he was surprised Carson had had him waiting at table his first evening.
"Yes, my lord.
Bates stuck the cufflinks to the box.
Thomas and I spoke to him a bit. Let him know we both know what war is like, and what it's like to come home not quite the same."
Good,
said Robert. There hadn't been much choice at the employment agency, but he had hoped that by giving him the job, they could do a bit of good for a man who had served his country and suffered for it. Thomas didn't get much opportunity to see whether or not Carson heeded his advice regarding Lang. The next day brought a convoy and put Thomas back on night duty. In hopes of taking some of that burden off himself and Sister Crawley, he was giving extra training to a couple of the cleverer orderlies in making clinical observations. They were coming along nicely, but the new crop of patients included several cases terribly burned from the newest horror, mustard gas. Since they had only a hastily written RAMC bulletin to give them an idea of what to watch out for with the new stuff, Thomas and Sister Crawley agreed that the two of them should take charge of those cases. Unlike the poisonous gases they'd seen before, which had victims drowning in the rot of their own lungs on the spot, mustard gas took hours to take effect. It settled into the victim's skin and clothing, causing great blistering chemical burns. The RAMC bulletin announced the hard-won knowledge that men exposed to the gas had to be stripped and scrubbed as soon as possible. But that knowledge had come late for some of these patients, who would not receive treatment until the blisters started to develop. 2 of these, burned over more than 3/4 of their bodies, died that first night, as did one who'd gotten a lungful of the stuff and, presumably, had the same kind of blistering on the inside. Others, more lightly exposed, were thought to have fairly decent chances, but the burns were agonizingly painful and highly prone to infection, so they required frequent medication and dressing changes, as well as monitoring for infection and for signs of lung trouble. Not that there was a great deal that could be done if either of those complications began to develop. On the evening of the dinner party for Captain Crawley, his new job had brought a promotion apparently, as well as a return to England, Thomas went down to the hospital early, as both Nurse Crawley and Sister Crawley would be leaving early to attend the dinner party. He arrived just in time to hear Nurse Crawley complaining, "I don't see the point of Mamma's soirees. What are they for?" In this case, the point was to welcome her cousin back from the war. It wasn't Thomas's place to say so, either to Nurse Crawley or Lady Sybil, though, and he rather thought Sister Crawley's calm reply, that she was going and looking forward to it, got the point across. Looking around the ward, he caught sight of Branson, standing off to one side and looking sheepish. Thomas supposed he must have been sent to round up Nurse Crawley and give Lady Sybil no excuse for not appearing on time. Seeing Thomas, he nodded to him and said, "Barrow, could have given you a lift down if I'd known you were on your way." "I don't mind the walk," Thomas said, although he'd not have minded the ride either. "I'll see if I can get them moving, shall I?" As he approached them, Nurse Crawley was saying, "To speak to Lieutenant Courtney when I gave him his pills. He's been having a difficult time." "I expect Corporal Barrow can talk with him," Sister Crawley answered. "Can't you?" "Of course," he said. "I'll be glad to." Courtenay was one of the gas cases, and that being so, had no business being as handsome as he was. Apart from the swath of bandages over his eyes, you'd not know there was anything wrong with him. "Still no improvement, then?" he asked, pitching the question between the two of them. "The chemical burns are healing nicely," Sister Crawley answered. "But as far as eyesight—" She shook her head. "That's a shame," Thomas said. Gas blindness usually wore off. Often it was caused as much by swelling and discharge around the eyes as anything else. But Courtenay had been gassed something like 10 days ago. Nurse Crawley handed over Courtenay's pills, a little sulkily, and went off with Branson. After briefing him on a few more cases, Sister Crawley made her own departure, and Thomas went to check on Courtenay. Courtenay, as it turned out, didn't want them. "All they do is make me sleepy," he said, "and I've slept all day already." Thomas couldn't really argue with that. They were only morphine tablets. "As you like, sir," he said. "I'll stop by a bit later, see if you feel differently." "All right," said Courtenay vaguely.
After that, there were the patients' dinners to get and medications to hand out to the gentlemen who did want them, and the other chores of settling the wards down for the night. But when all that was done, and the rest of the day shift had left, Thomas went back to Courtenay. He was in the new small ward, the one that had been the day room a couple of weeks ago, and the bed next to his was empty. They'd had one of the severe cases there a couple of days ago.
"It's Corporal Barrow, sir,"
he said, sitting on the neighbouring bed. Courtenay turned his head toward him. "Hello," he said. His voice was a bit glum, but Thomas thought he was smiling slightly.
"Nurse Crawley wanted to visit you, but she had to leave early," Thomas explained. "Her cousin's back from France for a bit. They're having him to dinner. So you're stuck with me instead."
"I don't mind," said Courtenay. "Her cousin. Is he related to Sister Crawley as well?"
"Her son," Thomas confirmed, "and heir to Nurse Crawley's father's title."
"There's a lot of that going around." Courtenay nodded. Cousins inheriting titles, he meant. By the time it was all over, if it ever was, likely more titles than not would be in the hands of distant relations.
"Yes, sir, but he has been since before the war, as it happens. His lordship never had a son, and the previous heir, a closer cousin, was killed."
Thomas's mind skittered away from the subject of sinking ships and who might have been killed on them, but he made himself add,
"On the Titanic."
"Rotten luck," Courtenay sympathized. "What about you?" he asked. "You're connected to the family somehow, aren't you?"
"Not really," Thomas said. "Well, sort of. I was their footman before the war."
"Oh," said Courtenay. "Sorry, I thought I heard you were staying with them."
"I am," Thomas said. "Sort of. When I was wounded, I needed some place to stay, and they hadn't replaced me, so—"
He didn't really want to talk about it.
"What about you, sir? What did you do before the war started?"
Not that it was any of his business, but he hoped Courtenay hadn't been a painter or something like that.
"I was up at Oxford," Courtenay said, tucking an arm behind his head. "But I only ever planned a farm. Farm, and shoot, and hunt, and fish, and everything I'll never do again." Not painting, then, but bad enough. Or he thought so, at least, from his despairing tone.
"You don't know that, sir,"
Thomas began. Sister Crawley had said they were to be optimistic where Lieutenant Courtenay's future was concerned, and he wasn't Peter. They never promised not to lie to each other. But he found the rest of the comforting formula, gas blindness wears off, sticking in his throat.
"I don't know about shooting nor hunting either, but I expect you could manage to ride, and fish, perhaps."
Courtenay scoffed. "Be taking around a paddock on a leading rein like a child on a pony? I don't think so."
"Well, at first," Thomas admitted, "it takes time to get your balance back."
One of Major Clarkson's medical journals had had an article about rehabilitating the blind, and on a slow night Thomas had read most of it.
"But I don't see why you couldn't do a bit of hacking out, once you'd got the hang of it. The horse can see, after all."
Courtenay frowned, but not in displeasure. At least Thomas thought not. It was difficult to read his expression with half his face obscured by bandages.
"It will take a very reliable horse," he said.
"I suppose so,"
Thomas agreed. He knew next to nothing about horses.
"And as for fishing, a lot of it's done by feel, isn't it?"
He knew almost as little about fishing, though he'd seen it done, setting up the luncheons and so on.
"I mean, the fish is on the water where you can't see it anyway."
"Sometimes you can't see it," Courtenay answered. "I'd probably get the line caught in the trees more often than I got it in the water."
"Perhaps," Thomas said. "But doesn't that happen anyway?"
Belatedly, he added, "Sir." Courtenay waved that off with a sigh. "I've never seen a blind man fish or ride," he said glumly. Thomas nearly pointed out that after he'd done it, he still wouldn't have seen it, but decided that might be in poor taste. Instead, he said,
"You don't know what you can handle until you have to try, sir. And that's not flannel. It's a fact. I expect in the war you did any number of things that you wouldn't have thought you could do if anyone had asked. I know I did."
Going on living after Peter died, for one.
"True enough," Courtenay conceded. "But most of those I didn't have a choice."
"You don't really have a choice about this either,"
Thomas pointed out bluntly. No more than he had about going on after Peter.
"Or not much of one, anyway. You can't choose whether you'll be blind or not. You can't even choose which things you'll be able to learn to do again and which you won't."
That didn't sound very encouraging. What was it he'd been thinking Courtenay did have choice about?
"All you get to choose is whether you try to do the things you want and find out whether you can or not. And I don't suppose it's my place to say, but the way I see it, you might as well try, since even if you fail, You're not any worse off than if you gave up before you started." Courtenay looked at him, or rather pointed his face in his direction, for a long moment.
"Perhaps," he finally said, "but I'll have to think about it."
"Yes, sir," Thomas said, getting up, "and I should probably check on some of the others." The next morning, Thomas reported to Sister Crawley, and to Nurse Crawley, who'd taken an interest in the case, that Lieutenant Courtenay had caught on that his blindness was likely to be permanent, neatly eluding over his own role in abandoning the official line on the subject. He said, "We talked a bit about what his life might be like if he is blind for good. He seemed to find that a bit more helpful than hoping for the best."
Did you talk about the Braille system of writing? Nurse Crawley asked eagerly. Or navigation using a cane?
No, Thomas admitted. "We mostly talked about country sports, the sorts of things he liked to do before the war."
"I expect that's important too," said Sister Crawley.
On his way out of the hospital, Thomas encountered Major Clarkson on his way in.
"Corporal Barrow," he said, waving him over, "I'm glad I caught you. Will you look in on Mr. Carson before you go off duty? I know he isn't a military patient, but since you're going up to the house anyway, you might just make sure there haven't been any developments I should know about."
"Of course, sir," Thomas said, because he couldn't possibly say anything else.
"I didn't know he was ill." "Yes, I suppose you wouldn't. They fetched me from home. He had an attack of angina. It doesn't seem to be anything serious. Stress, most likely. Remind him that he's to rest today and telephone if there's anything alarming."
He ran down the list of things that would be alarming. A bluish tinge to Carson's lips or fingernails, for instance. "Otherwise, I'll call on him in the afternoon."
"Yes, sir,"
Thomas said, comforting himself with the knowledge that Carson wouldn't enjoy this any more than he did. Up at the house, he found everything in an uproar and finally tracked Miss Hughes down in the breakfast room, where for some reason both she and Anna were supervising as Henry, set out the things for when the family came down. He explained the errand upon which Major Clarkson had sent him, concluding,
"And I can take a breakfast tray up to him while I'm at it, if you'd like."
"That would be very helpful," Miss Hughes said. "I want to look in on him myself, but I won't get a chance until later."
Thomas trooped back downstairs to fetch the breakfast tray. While she fixed it, Daisy filled him in further on the details of Carson's attack. It had apparently taken place right in the middle of the upstairs dinner. "I'm not sure what Henry did wrong," she said, "but Mr. Carson took the sauce away from him, and then when his attack started, he dropped the tray with the first course and poured the sauce on Lady Edith. Lady Sybil and Mr. Matthew had to carry him upstairs."
"I'm almost sorry I missed that,"
Thomas noted.
"It wasn't funny,"
Daisy said. She considered a moment and added, "Well, not then.
We all thought he was having a heart attack, but Dr. Clarkson said he weren't."
She plucked some toast onto a tray.
"There you go."
"Right," Thomas said, hefting it. Then he put it down.
"Has anyone checked that he's—"
He just managed not to say alive.
"awake?"
Daisy nodded.
"Mr. Bates looked in on him?"
Thomas picked up the tray again.
"If I'm not back in 20 minutes, send a rescue party."
Carson, fortunately, at least on balance, Thomas decided it was fortunate, was still both alive and awake when Thomas got to his room.
"What are you doing with that?"
he asked peevishly.
"Major Clarkson asked me to look in on you,"
he said, putting it down on the desk.
"And Miss Hughes wanted me to bring that while I was at it."
He reached for Carson's wrist, and Carson snatched it away with a look of incredulous horror.
"What are you—" "Taking your pulse,"
Thomas said, repressing a sigh. "Honestly,
I haven't got any designs on your virtue, believe me."
Carson's pulse was strong and steady, if a bit rapid, and his lips and nails were, fortunately, their normal color.
"Have you had any more chest pain since last night?"
"No," Carson said.
"Any pain in your neck or shoulder?"
"No."
"Shortness of breath?"
"No."
"Right then."
Thomas got the tray from the desk and put it on Carson's lap.
"He says to remind you you're supposed to rest, and he'll look in on you in the afternoon. Mrs. Hughes will probably come up for that,"
he said, indicating the tray. He turned to go, but Carson said,
"Right."
Thomas waited.
"Heaven only know what Henry is doing in the breakfast room,"
Carson began, then paused, nerving himself up to ask Thomas to look in on that too, Thomas thought, and just barely managed to restrain himself from pointing out that Whatever Lang was doing, it probably didn't involve pouring sauce on Lady Edith.
Miss Hughes is in there with him, and Anna as well. Hope you feel better, Mr. Carson.
He left, closing the door firmly behind him. Thomas wasn't at all surprised that Carson had decided that Lang was to blame for last night's incident, but he was a bit surprised to see everyone else acting as though Lang were in disgrace, including Lang. He slumped into his seat, still between Ethel and O'Brien, and asked in a defeated tone,
Did Mr. Carson say anything? He wanted to know if everything was all right in the breakfast room,
Thomas answered. I told him you and Miss Hughes had it under control. Lang opened his mouth, then closed it again, as Miss Hughes made her entrance, and they all stood up. Once they were all seated, Thomas reported to Miss Hughes on Carson's recovery, and once the teapot and toast started making their rounds, continued to Lang.
I wouldn't worry about it. It isn't as though anyone's died.
No, Lang said.
But Lady Edith's dress will never be the same.
Who gives a fuck?
She has others.
Anna gave him a growling look, and Miss Hughes said,
That just may be, but I'm sure she doesn't like having one of them spoiled.
Thomas opened his mouth, then stuffed a piece of toast in it, thinking very carefully about what he was going to say next. Swallowing, he said,
Maybe I've gotten hold of the wrong end of the stick, but who was it actually spilled the sauce on Lady Edith?
For a long moment no one answered.
He was ill, Miss Hughes said.
I realize that,
Thomas said, but he wasn't the only one, was the point.
I got ahead of him, somehow, Lang said. I had the sauce and the bubble toast, so I was meant to be following him, and I don't know what happened. He told me to give him the sauce, and then it all happened very quickly. So things had got a bit muddled, Thomas translated. But it wasn't until Carson worked himself up into a state that anything was actually spoiled. He watched puzzled looks go around the table as everyone tried to figure out what he'd gotten wrong in this recasing of events. There were two things, really. Or rather, two things right with it, both nearly unthinkable. Finally, Bates voiced the first of them. I suppose in the scheme of things, it isn't very important.
That one Thomas had known all along, although he'd done a pretty good job of not thinking about it until he'd gotten to France. Or maybe a little earlier than that. The other one no one said, but Thomas didn't really expect any of them to. It had taken him, of all people, quite a while to figure it out. After breakfast, he went out into the courtyard for a cigarette, and Anna joined him.
Don't you have to dress them?
He asked.
Lady Mary won't ring for a bit yet, and Lady Edith had a tray earlier. She wanted to get up to the farm.
Right, Thomas had forgotten about Lady Edith's stint as an amateur land girl. Anna hesitated.
I know you mean to help, she said, but I'm not sure making a fuss is the best thing for Henry.
She had a point. Hadn't he told Carson it was best not to draw attention to things? But
it's not really about him.
Anna frowned.
Then what is it about?
Thomas looked away. There wasn't much point saying it. None of them would believe him.
What's Carson's job?
Anna made a small sound of exasperation.
He's the butler.
I know, but what's he do?
He runs the house,
she said doubtfully.
Serves the dinners, or supervises serving the dinners. Looks after the wine and the silver.
His job,
Thomas said, and took a long drag on a cigarette. It wasn't quite look after your lads. No, but it wasn't that far away either. He blew the smoke out slowly.
Is to make sure the rest of you, do yours.
Oh, Anna said. I suppose it is, now that you mention it. A big part of it, anyway.
And here's the thing,
Thomas said. He took another pull from his cigarette and let it out slowly.
Is he any bloody good in it?
Anna actually squeaked.
Thomas,
she said once she'd recovered enough to form words.
You can't. Sure I can, Thomas said. I don't work for him, and even if I did, I could still say it. He isn't. He's a bully. And if bullying doesn't get the results he wants, he's out of ideas.
He flicked ash from his cigarette.
But that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is, why'd you all get the idea it was Henry's fault what happened up there?
He jerked his chin in the general direction of the dining room.
Well,
Anna said, and stopped.
He must have...
She blinked a few times rapidly and said,
I'm not sure.
Because, Thomas said gently, it can't possibly have been Carson's, right? And it had to be somebody's. Anna was silent. He's in charge, Thomas said. That means whatever happened, it's his fault. Even if it wasn't. He shrugged. So both of them cracked a bit under the massive strain of serving at a dinner party. Lang's got a much better excuse for it than Carson does.
Perhaps, Anna said carefully, it's too soon for him to be working again.
Which of them?
Thomas asked.
Anna gave him a sardonic look. Only one of them's had to take to his bed after last night's debacle, Thomas pointed out. He lit another cigarette. But yeah, might be too soon for him to work under a sadist like Carson. I doubt my nerves could handle it, to be honest. Anna seemed about to say something, but at that moment Lang stuck his head out the back door. Lady Mary's ringing for you, he said.
Oh,
Anna said, glancing over at him. Yeah, I'll see you later, Thomas told her. To Lang he added, come here if you've got a minute. Warily, Lang exchanged places with Anna. Carson's a right bastard, Thomas said, angling his cigarette case toward Lang. Lang nodded, taking one. They're all completely cowed by him, Thomas went on. I was his punching bag before the war, but... well... I don't think I'll be here much longer, said Lang. Do you want to be? Lang was silent for a moment. I need to work, he said finally. It's not easy to find a place with a raw record like mine. Suppose not, Thomas agreed. He smoked and thought for a moment. One thing you could do with a problem like this was kick it up the chain, but Thomas couldn't quite picture his lordship coming up with a solution. It was more of an NCO-shaped problem. We ought to get Bates in on this, he said reluctantly. He was a sergeant. If he come up with some kind of plan, he could take it to his lordship. Lang eyed him. Why? What's it to you? Thomas had to think about that one for a moment. What was it to him? Then everything slotted into place. Because I'm the fucking corporal, he said. Lang drew his breath in sharply. I'm not a soldier, he said. Not anymore. I am. He shook his head. I've forgotten. Were you at the 14th when that thing with Kingston happened? Lang looked blank. He was the one with the broken leg. You'd remember if you were there. And Corporal Rouse got FP? No, Lang said. I remember a Corporal Rouse, but how did a corporal get FP?
So Thomas summarized the story. Kingston's hysterical paralysis, Rouse's conviction that it wasn't, the midnight raids on the X-ray hut, and how Rouse had been caught. Rouse missed a trick there. He got into a tug-of-war with Major Winthrop over it, with Kingston as the rope, poor bastard. And if Thomas wasn't careful, he could repeat that error now. Thomas had realized in his discussion with Anna that he was spoiling for a fight with Carson, and it wouldn't do Lang any good to be in the middle of it. So when they put Rouse on FP, they put Kingston on one of my work crews. I don't think I was wrong to try to stay out of it before. There wasn't a lot I could have done. But then I had to take a side, and I chose the wrong one. He skimmed lightly over the first work detail, carrying building materials back and forth while Rouse, tied to a post, was forced to watch. Lang didn't need that image in his head, and picked the story up with the grave digging from his fawning efforts to appease Major Winthrop, right up until the wet snap of Kingston's leg. I can still hear it. Lang shuddered a little. God knew what he was hearing. So I watched Carson have a go at you, and it feels like I'm right back there, watching him fall on the ground. Only I might be able to get it right this time. Maybe. Or at least make a different mistake. In the dining room, Lang fell silent. Thomas gave him a moment, then said, You want to try that again? At the front, he said. He shook his head. I can't really talk about it, but I froze up. It was like I couldn't remember what I was doing there. What I was supposed to do next, and... People got hurt, Thomas suggested. Lang nodded. And when I get muddled, as you put it, that's where I go. It feels like I'm right back there. He echoed Thomas's words. Watching it, and there's something I'm supposed to do, but I don't know what it is. He glanced at the cigarette, which had burned down almost to his fingers without him taking so much as a puff out of it. As far as Thomas had noticed, I don't think there's any way I can ever make it come out right.
Anna had hoped to have another word with Thomas, but between one thing and another, in addition to her usual duties, she was keeping an eye on Henry, and the schedule of activities for Mr. Matthew's visit demanded frequent costume changes for Lady Mary. She scarcely had a chance to catch her breath. She finally managed to sit down in the servants' hall during the upstairs luncheon, which Henry was serving under Mrs. Hughes's personal supervision, but of course by then he had long gone up to bed.
I didn't see him again after he went out to smoke,
Mr. Bates said.
He probably didn't want to be roped into helping cover for Mr. Carson.
Probably, Anna agreed. That was probably part of it, at least. She hesitated. Has he, Thomas, I mean, said anything about having trouble with his nerves since the war?
Mr. Bates raised his eyebrows. I don't think he'd say a thing like that to me if I held his feet to an open flame. Why, has he to you?
Not exactly, Anna said. We were talking about Henry, and he said he didn't think his nerves could handle working under Mr. Carson either.
She decided to leave out the part about Mr. Carson being a sadist.
Bates said.
Well, he's touchier since he's been back.
Is he? I'm not sure that's the word. He was steadier, in a way, except for things like their conversation this morning or his outbursts about being blamed for everything. I suppose it's more like he actually cares, instead of just saying awful things to get a reaction, she mused. Bates nodded thoughtfully.
Yes, I think that's it.
Suddenly, Anna remembered Mr. Fitzroy in Kew Gardens saying, he takes things to heart. Perhaps he always had cared and was just now showing it. Mr. Bates went on.
If he does care what people think of him, it's no surprise he wouldn't want to work for Mr. Carson again. I'm not sure he'll ever come around on Thomas.
Now Anna remembered Thomas oddly vulnerable in his dressing gown, asking if they were admitting now that Carson didn't like him. Do you think Mr. Carson... Well, no, she couldn't ask if Bates thought Mr. Carson was a bully, not here in the servants' hall. What do you think of him in terms of managing people, I suppose? Mr. Bates gave her a puzzled look, and she added, Thomas had some choice words on the subject.
Oh,
said Bates.
I expect he would.
He considered.
I wouldn't say it's his best area now. Look at Thomas for starters. Who would have guessed? There was a hard-working and reasonably pleasant version of him in there. And that sergeant of his in France managed to find it in less than a month. He must be some kind of a genius at getting the most out of his men.
Thomas seems to think a lot of him, Anna agreed. The wardmaster, I mean. He mentioned him from time to time, usually in the context of something he learned from him. Bates went on.
I expect Thomas is thinking about how Carson's way of doing things would work in the army. And it wouldn't. In the army, you get the men they give you, and it's your job. As an NCO especially, but for officers too. To figure out how you're going to use them to do what needs doing. Our regiment in South Africa was... I shouldn't be the one to say it, but it's a pretty elite regiment, the Grenadier Guards. And we still had our share of men you wouldn't necessarily choose. The real scoundrels you can kick out, but that sort of thing can destroy a man's life. So mostly you've got to work around their weaknesses and try to find some way to improve them.
Thomas said something about that, Anna recalled. He said that if Mr. Carson isn't getting the results he wants, he just, tries more of what he always does. Bates nodded.
And here he can. This being the kind of house it is, he expects to be able to handpick his men, and if they're not up to scratch, he can send them on their way. Until now, he didn't need to know how to adjust to a subordinate he didn't find particularly promising.
Mr. Bates paused.
Well, except for me.
Anna started to protest, but Mr. Bates said,
No, it's true. I can't do some of the things a valet in a house like this normally would. Carrying in luggage, waiting at table. I expect I could manage to pitch in somehow if I had to. In fact, if Mr. Carson's still in bed tomorrow evening, when we have guests to dine again, I think I had best try. But until now, he's not had to resort to that either.
Thomas slept badly, with dreams he didn't want to think about, and when he woke for the 4th or 5th time, and saw it was only about an hour before his alarm would go, he decided to just get up. Luckily, he was not quite so early as to run into the downstairs tea, and he managed to bolt down the cold food Daisy had set aside for him from lunch, grab his packet of sandwiches, and be out the door without having to really speak to anyone.
It wasn't until he was halfway down to the village that he remembered that Carson was supposed to be in bed, and couldn't possibly have caught him leaving, much less had somehow found out that Thomas had said out loud that he was bad at his job. It was a quiet time when they arrived at the hospital, a bit before the patient's dinner, so Thomas gave in to the impulse to look in on Lieutenant Courtenay first, before reporting in officially to the ward sister. After all, he wasn't really on duty yet. It was a fine, warm day, and most of the ambulatory patients were out taking the air, but Courtenay was lying listlessly on his bed. He must have heard Thomas approaching, because he raised his head a little, as if looking to see who had come in. The bandages had been removed, but it was plain he still wasn't seeing anything. "It's Corporal Barrow, sir," he said once he was near enough that he could speak softly and not wake the handful of other patients who were dozing in the ward. Courtenay sat up. "Is it that time already?"
"No, sir, I'm a bit early."
"Oh," he said. "Are you busy? I mean, did something happen?"
"Not at all,"
Thomas said, taking a seat on the still vacant neighboring bed.
"I just couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd come down here and see if I could make myself useful."
"In that case," Courtenay said, reaching inside his jacket, "I've had a letter from my people. I don't really want to know what it says, but I suppose I might as well get it over with." He held the envelope out in Thomas's general direction. Thomas took the letter out and unfolded it.
"It starts, 'Dear Edward.'"
"Wait," said Courtenay. "Tell me who signed it first, please."
Thomas flipped it over. "Mother."
Courtenay sighed. "All right, could be worse."
"Dear Edward," Thomas repeated, "we were all very sorry to hear that your condition has not improved. It must be very difficult to send a proper letter when you must ask someone to write it for you."
Was it Thomas's imagination, or was there something a little pointed in that? He continued,
"Given what has happened, Jack has decided to accept the post in London after all. If only you had been so sensible."
Thomas paused. "Really?" "Go on." Thomas read on. There were a few lines about Jack and the London position, something in the War Office, it sounded like, and then a bit about the family farm. As he read it, Courtenay shifted uncomfortably.
"Of course you understand that things cannot be as they were, and whatever you think, Jack has your best interests at heart."
"Stop." Thomas stopped. Courtenay didn't say anything else, and after a moment's hesitation, Thomas ventured,
"Who's Jack?"
"My younger brother." Courtenay lay down, throwing his arm across his eyes. "He means to replace me. It's what he always wanted."
"Ah."
Thomas cast about for something to say.
"Well, you—"
"What? Can't let him? Could he stop him?" "I'm sorry," Courtenay said, his voice brittle. "I mustn't bore you." Sometimes Thomas really wondered how the upper class had agreed that that was the phrase to use when you'd accidentally let on that you were having a crisis. It wasn't as though they could have discussed it.
"Look,"
he said, then stopped. Not the best choice of words, really.
"He wants to, but do you have to let him?"
It was at the top of his mind just now, how you didn't necessarily have to let people push you around just because it was what they'd always done, and they'd somehow convinced you that you deserved it. "How can I not?" Courtenay asked.
"I don't know, but you have to fight your corner, don't you? All my life they've pushed me around just 'cause I'm—"
No, we couldn't say that. Everyone might know up at the house, but they didn't know here, unless Nurse Crawley had been spreading it around. Courtenay sat up. "Because you're what?" Thomas swallowed hard.
"A bastard, for one thing."
Courtenay made a small sound of disagreement, and he said,
"No, I mean really. My mother... I don't know exactly what happened, but I was born much too soon after the marriage, and her husband knew he wasn't the one responsible."
"Oh," said Courtenay.
"And the reason I'm mentioning it is I've got a younger brother too. Younger half-brother. They didn't tell me until I was about school-leaving age, you know. And me dad, the one I thought was me dad, had this clock shop, and, well, they just pushed me out of the way. I went into service, and there wasn't anything I could do about it because I was 14, and he wasn't really me dad. And Mum was dead by then."
Courtenay didn't say anything for a long moment, then reached out and put his hand on Thomas's knee. It was hard to tell what he meant by it. Hard to tell what Thomas wanted him to mean by it. But he put his hand on top of Courtenay's and said,
So you might be blind, but you're not a 14-year-old bastard orphan. There's got to be something you can use to fight back.
Like what?
Your brain for a start. You're clever, aren't you?
He ought to be up at Oxford.
Something else occurred to him. Is there an entail on this farm of yours?
He'd heard enough about entails before the war to get the idea you couldn't just nip somebody out of the line because you wanted to. There is, but I'll never have a wife and heir with things as they are now. That'll be the next thing she says in the letter. He took his hand off Thomas's knee to point to it. Go on and look, but I know it is. Thomas looked.
You're right.
Jack's engaged. Thomas nodded, then remembered Courtenay wouldn't seem doing it.
Yeah,
He said.
she mentions that too.
He scanned the rest of the letter. There wasn't much of it, to see if there were any other objections. There weren't, just a mention of finding a servant to look after you. Now, that was an idea for Thomas after the war, looking after a crippled gentleman. He put that thought aside and said,
But so what? Lord Grantham never had a son, and that doesn't mean he isn't the Earl now.
It isn't the same, Courtenay said.
No, but what have you actually got to do running the farm? You aren't out there ploughing the fields yourself, are you?
Of course not, but would have made all the decisions about what to plant and where and when and improvements on the farm. He shook his head. I'm going around to the tenants and advising them. Despairingly, he said, I can't run the farm if I don't know what's happening on it. They could just say they've done the planting and bunk off for a pint and I'd never know.
So you'll need someone go round with you and describe what he sees, Thomas said. He'd need to know enough about farming to understand what he's seeing.
Which put Thomas right out if he'd been thinking along those lines, which he hadn't.
And be absolutely trustworthy so you can rely on what he's telling you.
That put Thomas out too.
Could be a job for a younger brother if you had a better one, but in the circumstances, probably have to look elsewhere.
You make it all sound so easy, Courtenay said.
Not easy, Thomas said, but possible.
You know, Courtenay said, when you talk like that, I almost believe you.
You should,
Thomas said. Other ambulatory patients were starting to drift back into the ward now, and he'd best not let them see him sitting around.
And I should probably help them with the dinner since I'm here,
he said, standing up. Of course, Courtenay said a little stiffly. I've taken up too much of your time.
No,
Thomas said, then fumbled for what to say next. He hadn't. Thomas enjoyed it. It was his job. Instead of any of those, he blurted out,
We could go fishing.
What?
I've got Tuesday afternoon off, he explained. And, well, we could try it. Supposed to be a decent trout stream on the estate.
Not that he had any business inviting people to fish in it, but Nurse Crawley would help. He was nearly sure of it. All right, said Courtenay. It seems I have an empty spot in my social calendar.
Right, Thomas said. I'll, make the arrangements.
Fortunately, Nurse Crawley was on board.
Of course,
she said as they dished up the patients' dinners. That seems like just the thing to lift his spirits. I'll ask Papa tonight, but I don't see how he can refuse.
Thank you, Thomas said. I meant to say something to you first, but he seemed down in the dumps, so...
Should we try to get up a party, do you think? She asked. I'm on duty that afternoon, but Cousin Matthew should still be here, and, well, I'm not sure who else we might be able to find, but I can ask around. That, Courtenay going fishing with other gentlemen and Thomas along as a servant, was a bit more proper than what Thomas had had in mind, but
it'll be his first time fishing since he's been blind, he pointed out. Might make him a bit self-conscious having strangers watching.
You're right, she said. Then I'll just ask Papa to lend some fishing gear and recommend a spot. Once he's got the hang of it, perhaps we can try something more elaborate. She took on a speculative look. You know, I'm sure he isn't the only one missing country sports. If Papa doesn't kick too much, we might arrange more outings for the patients. Thomas decided not to remind her that at the moment they weren't keeping many convalescents. That could change again once the push was over.
We could,
he agreed. Before she left for the evening, Nurse Crawley handed him a book she'd found about the rehabilitation of the blind. I've been finding out about how to help him learn to walk with a stick and so on, she explained. We can start on that tomorrow. Thomas stayed late at the hospital the next morning, helping Lieutenant Courtenay and Nurse Crawley with the first lesson in what was apparently called cane travel. It went well enough, Thomas thought, though Courtenay complained of feeling like a priceless ass making his way up and down the ward, and the cane did make something of a racket, thwacking against the floor and the legs of beds and so on. They agreed to try having the next session outdoors, and Thomas agreed to come in early that afternoon for it. Up at the house, he found that they'd all survived the night. Lang and Anna had managed to serve the dinner, to the family only this time, without dumping anything on anyone. Carson was still confined to his bed, but Thomas was not called upon to examine him again, fortunately, as reports from the field indicated he was becoming increasingly obstreperous.
You know, Mr. Matthew, Miss Crawley, and the Dowager are dining here again tomorrow night,
Bates said as Thomas shoveled in his late breakfast.
He's agreed to stay in bed. I gather Miss Hughes threatened to tie him down if he didn't, but he doesn't want Henry anywhere near it. I said I'd help, but Miss Hughes talked him round to having Anna and Ethel do it.
So what's Lang going to do? Thomas asked. Twiddle his thumbs and wait to get sacked? Bates sighed.
I'm not sure what the alternative is.
Thomas wasn't either. He'd come up with an idea, but it was one he'd not have liked in Lang's place. Has Bassett managed to hang on to any undergardeners? Bates gave him a puzzled look.
No, and we can't have an undergardener waiting at table. We'd be better off asking Brownson if it came to that.
I don't care about the dinner party, Thomas said impatiently. For Lang! It was outdoor work they had us doing with them at the clearing station. He was all right with it. I doubt he'll fancy it much. I wouldn't. But he might do that for a couple of months, then try the dining room again if he's feeling a bit steadier. Bates went on looking at him, a strange expression on his face. Or not, Thomas said with a sigh. He'd forgotten where he was for a moment there.
No,
Bates said.
that could work if he's interested, but he might prefer to try another house than go that far down the ladder.
Maybe, Thomas said. He shrugged. He said he was having trouble finding a place, though, and I get the impression that feeling like he's being watched is part of the problem. He might do better behind the scenes. That way, if he has trouble, he can just collect himself and move on. Bates nodded.
I see. I suppose my role in this is to put it to his lordship.
Naturally, Thomas answered. Bates was the sergeant after all. Dealing with officers was his job. You could put it to Lang too if you see him. I don't have time to make an opportunity to talk to him. They want me back at the hospital early. That was true. Nurse Crawley and Lieutenant Courtenay did. It wasn't his problem if Bates thought they meant somebody else.
Fine,
said Bates with a long-suffering sigh. Thomas took himself off to bed and slept decently enough. No dreams about being tied to a post in the dining room while Lang dragged a broken leg around in front of him at least. Then got away clean to the hospital a bit after tea time. Nurse Crawley had set up a sort of obstacle course on the lawn, using a few chairs, and Lieutenant Courtenay worked his way through it, slowly at first, but then with increasing confidence. That's right, sir, Thomas said, more formal since Nurse Crawley was present. If you move the stick fast enough, you won't have to slacken your pace. It was nearly verbatim from the book, and so was Nurse Crawley's edition. And check the width of the space as well as any possible obstruction. Courtenay fetched up against the back of one of the chairs, and as he was working his way round it, Thomas noticed Major Clarkson approaching. Major, 3 o'clock, he murmured. The book had also discussed how to use the numbers of an imaginary clock face to indicate directions to a blind person, and they'd worked on it a little. Courtenay straightened up, turning in that direction, and murmured back, Has he got a hat on? No. Not that it made much difference to Courtenay. He didn't either. Thomas did, but since the Major was hatless, there was no need for any of them to salute. Nurse Crawley gave both of them a puzzled look, but there was no time to explain. The Major was nearly there. Thomas came to attention, and Courtenay straightened up a bit. Lieutenant Courtenay, Clarkson said. Well done, you're making good progress. Thanks to my saviours, sir, Courtenay said. A polite formula, perhaps, but Thomas wasn't sure he'd ever been described as someone's savior before. Clarkson continued, as if Courtenay hadn't spoken. So you'll be pleased to hear that we're all agreed that it's time for you to continue your treatment elsewhere. Thomas wondered who had agreed to that, but he didn't have time to think about it. Courtenay was very plainly not pleased. What? He said in a small voice. At Farley Hall, Clarkson amplified. You're not ill anymore, he said kindly. All you need is time to adjust to your condition, and the staff at Farley can help with that. Thomas glanced worriedly at Courtenay. He was about to speak, but Courtenay beat him to it.
But, sir, he said, a hint of desperation in his tone, these two are helping me. Here.
Now Major Clarkson began to look impatient. I'm sure Nurse Crawley and Corporal Barrow are doing their best, but they're not trained in specialist care.
Courtenay practically interrupted, saying, please don't send me away, not yet.
Sir, Thomas said reasonably, surely we... Major Clarkson turned a sharp look on him and Thomas shut his mouth and braced up. Thomas had at least succeeded in drawing fire away from Courtenay. Major Clarkson's voice was gentler as he continued, Lieutenant, you must know that every one of our beds is needed for the injured and dying from arras. Courtenay made only a small sound of negation and shrugged off Major Clarkson's attempt at an avuncular pat on the arm. Thomas tried again. Sir, could I speak to you in private? The look Major Clarkson gave him was perhaps slightly less hostile. Yes, he said. I'll be in my office. Yes, sir, Thomas said. Major Clarkson took himself off.
What are we going to do?
Nurse Crawley said before he was quite out of earshot. Shut! Thomas said, holding up one finger. When the Major's back disappeared from view, he said, all right, he's gone. I don't know, but it's going to be tricky. Something's got his back up. What happened before I got here?
I'm not sure, Nurse Crawley said. He asked what I was doing when I was setting up the chairs and things. Then he wanted to know whose idea it had been, and I said it was mine, but I discussed it with you and Cousin Isabel. Sister Crawley, I mean.
She corrected herself. Right, Thomas said with a sigh. I didn't think to clear it with either of the medical officers. He'd barely seen them being on night duty, but that wasn't an excuse. He could at least have reminded Nurse Crawley to do it.
Sister Crawley thought it was a good idea,
Nurse Crawley said a little belligerently. She's not the commanding officer, Thomas pointed out. He shook his head. I'd best not keep him waiting.
Should I come too? She asked. I can explain about what we're doing.
She could argue with him, she meant. Better not, Thomas advised, remembering what a mistake it had been to take Rollins along to make their official complaint to the billeting officer in France. Let me see what I can do first, all right? The others agreed, and Thomas headed inside, trying quickly to put his thoughts in some kind of order. He couldn't risk sounding like he was questioning Major Clarkson's medical judgment, not when he'd had enough of that from Sister Crawley. But what did he know that Clarkson didn't? Well, he knew Courtenay, which was all perfectly all right and above board. Nurses and orderlies spent more time with patients than doctors did. Doctors relied on them for information about patients, but just information, not conclusions or recommendations, certainly not demands. Right, he could do this. Major Clarkson was standing behind his desk when he got there and not looking at all pleased. What is it you wanted, Corporal? He said brusquely. Sir, he said, keeping his tone humble, his accent working class but trying. I spoke out of turn and it was wrong of me. It's just that I'm worried for Lieutenant Courtenay. He paused. Major Clarkson didn't make any sign of encouragement, but he didn't order him to shut up either, so he continued. I've been helping him with his letters home, you see, reading them to him and writing his replies. That was a lie. He'd only read the one letter, and while they'd discussed a reply, they hadn't gotten as far as writing one. But he couldn't say that they'd been having heart-to-heart chats in the middle of the night. So I've learned a bit about what's going on in his mind. Major Clarkson sighed. And what is that? He's having a lot of trouble seeing a way forward with his condition, and his family unfortunately seem to feel the same way. They've given up on him. So this, us sending him away, seems like more of the same. Sir, I know there are other people more qualified to help him than Nurse Crawley and me, but he trusts us. And at this early stage, with everything so uncertain, that seems important. Major Clarkson sat resting his forehead on his hand and rubbed his eyelids with his thumb and ring finger. I see. You may be right, Corporal, that staying here for a little while longer would be best for Lieutenant Courtenay. Thomas's heart leapt, but the Major continued. The trouble is, we have a full convoy coming tomorrow afternoon of wounded and dying from Arras. I have to think about what's best for those patients, too. Yes, sir, Thomas said. He did, of course, but it was only one bed. Surely they could cram Lieutenant Courtenay in somewhere. They have urgent medical needs, Major Clarkson continued. Needs for the kind of care we are set up to provide here. And once they arrive, I'll need you and Nurse Crawley to focus on your regular duties. You won't have time to give Lieutenant Courtenay special attention." Thomas briefly considered, pointing out that he was not strictly speaking on duty at the moment. With a convoy coming, he'd be pulling extra duty whether he wanted to or not.
"Yes, sir,"
Thomas said, trying to think if there was anything else he could say. He couldn't mention the fishing plans. Likely with the convoy on Monday, his time off would be cancelled anyway. Well, there was something he could say.
"I'd like to be able to tell him I'll go and look in on him on my afternoon off. See how he's settling in. I feel like that might help a bit. Would that be all right, sir?"
Major Clarkson nodded. "Yes, I could tell the staff at Farley Hall to expect you." "When?"
"It was set for Tuesday, sir, but—"
"Let's say Thursday," Major Clarkson said. "Things ought to have settled down again by then."
"Yes, sir. Thank you, sir."
"All right." Major Clarkson glanced at something. "A duty roster, by the looks of it. I'll need you on duty early tomorrow to receive the convoy. It's due at 3 o'clock. It wouldn't be at all a good idea for him to stay on to see the Farley Hall convoy off then. Those usually left at about 10 in the morning."
"Yes, sir."
"But I'll ask Sister Crawley if she can spare Nurse Crawley to accompany the patients going to Farley Hall in the morning," Major Clarkson said. "Perhaps that will be of some comfort to Lieutenant Courtenay as well."
"Yes, sir,"
Thomas agreed. He wished it was him, but
I expect that will help.
"Very good. And the two of you can help him pack his things."
With that, Major Clarkson dismissed him. Thomas went back outside and found Nurse Crawley and Lieutenant Courtenay. They were sitting on a bench near where she had set up the obstacle course. So close their knees were nearly touching. Thomas fought down a stab of unbecoming jealousy. "There he is," Thomas heard Nurse Crawley say to Courtenay. More loudly, she asked, "What did he say?" Thomas shook his head.
"No joy,"
he said, perching on the edge of the bench. He explained about the convoy.
"He was sympathetic, but he pointed out we'll be too busy for anything extra, even if you could stay, sir."
"Damn," Courtenay said, his voice brittle. "Then, I beg your pardon, Nurse Crawley." "It's all right," she said. Thomas got out his cigarettes and offered them around.
"He did say, Nurse Crawley, that you can go along to Farley Hall in the morning, as long as Sister Crawley can spare you, and help get Lieutenant Courtenay and the others settled."
"Oh," she said, lighting a cigarette. "I'm sure she'll say yes." "That's very kind of him," Courtenay said dully, fumbling for the lighter that Nurse Crawley was attempting to hand to him. Thomas resisted the impulse to take it away and light Courtenay's cigarette for him. Not only would it look funny, but it was better for his independence to manage what he could on his own.
"And I'll come and visit you on my afternoon off," he said. "It's been changed to Thursday because of the new patients, and I'm not sure if we'll be able to manage fishing, but we can at least take a walk."
Some of the convalescent homes were organized along hospital-like lines, while others had the atmosphere of a permanent house party. He wasn't sure which kind Farley Hall was. "Thank you," Courtenay breathed in sharply, and Thomas looked away. Not that Courtenay would know either way, but if he was going to cry, Thomas would just as soon not watch. "I'm sure it'll be all right," Nurse Crawley said bravely. "I expect everyone there is just as nice as we are." "I don't see how," Courtenay said, sounding as though he had a head cold. Thomas shifted further onto the bench so that his shoulder brushed against Courtenay's. He thought about sitting on the steps of the dugout with Rouse and Rollins a few hours before he was shot and taken away from them forever.
"Nobody warns you about this part of war," he said. "You get attached to people, and you know anybody can be killed, but nobody tells you about how they can just move you around like—"
His voice wobbled a little, and Nurse Crawley glanced over at him across Lieutenant Courtenay. Courtenay reached out and patted his knee. "Like pieces on a chessboard," he said. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, shakily. "I've heard like cattle, but we have a dairy herd. You know, they have friends, cows. A good dairyman knows which ones like each other. They produce better, they're easier to handle if they get to stay with their friends." Thomas thought of the barn and how the wardmaster had kept them there together as long as he could.
"I didn't know that."
"Nor did I," Nurse Crawley said. Then she broke the solemnity of the moment by saying, "And I rather hope it isn't beef for dinner now." They laughed a bit at that, far more than it warranted, and in due course they saw Lieutenant Courtenay back to his bed and helped him pack his things. Thomas hoped that he and Courtenay would have a talk later on once the ward was settled down for the night, but when the time came, Courtenay said that he was Rather tired, actually.
And Thomas couldn't really argue with him. Yes, sir, he said. You've got a big day tomorrow.
He went and occupied himself in the main ward for a while, updating the logbook, checking that the linens and the drug cupboards were fully stocked, ready for whatever the afternoon convoy would bring them. Selfishly, though, he hoped that Lieutenant Courtenay would have trouble sleeping, and after a couple of hours, when the rest of the hospital was fast asleep, he crept back into the smaller ward. Drip. Drip. Thomas's first thought was that the roof had gone. Absurd, since the night was perfectly clear. His second, that someone had pissed the bed. Not an uncommon occurrence dealing with the sick. But while he was thinking about it, his feet carried him further into the room toward Courtenay's bed, and the slowly spreading puddle was far too dark for the obvious explanation. No longer caring whether he woke the rest of the ward, or the rest of the village for that matter, Thomas hurried the last few steps.
Sir? Lieutenant Courtenay? Edward!
The arm that Thomas grabbed for was slick with blood laid open from wrist to elbow. The other wasn't much better. But at Courtenay's neck he felt a slow, faint pulse. By now some of the other gentlemen on the ward had woken up.
I say, what's all the... shit! All the racket?
A louder voice cut over the chatter.
Corporal?
At the same instant the overhead lights came on. Private Parker, who was on duty tonight.
What's going on? He's alive,
Thomas said, pressing a wad of sheet to the worst of the wounds.
Get me some... No, go get...
He took a deep breath.
Bring me a dressing tray, and then run for the ammo, now!
Parker went. He brought the dressing tray in record time and then disappeared again. Thomas quickly packed the left arm with lint and wrapped it in gauze, tight as he dared. He'd worry about infection later. The first thing was to slow the bleeding. How much had he lost already? A lot, but it was hard to guess the quantity when it was all spread out on the floor like that. Captain Allenby had said so once. The right arm wasn't cut as badly. Courtenay must have done the other first and then fumbled the blade. He wrapped it, then went back to put more pressure on the other, holding it closed with his hands.
Come on, Edward, he murmured. Hang in there, all right? You've got to get home to those cows of yours so you can keep them with their friends.
It seemed like hours before Major Clarkson arrived. Hours, or maybe seconds. They moved Courtenay into the prep room and Major Clarkson got to work stitching up his arms.
How? Major Clarkson asked. How did he do this? I don't know, Thomas said. I don't know. I should have stayed with him.
Clarkson's voice gentled.
You couldn't have known. None of us could have.
He finished the stitching and felt Courtenay's pulse at his neck.
He's shocky. Parker, a bottle of saline and an intravenous kit now.
Parker brought in the requested items. Is it going to make it, sir?
I don't know,
Clarkson said, examining Courtenay's right arm. He must have been able to find a vein Courtenay had missed because he put the needle in there.
He may have lost too much blood.
There was a solution for that, Thomas knew. It would have to be put to Clarkson delicately, and he'd have no idea how to begin.
Transfusion!
He blurted out.
The look Major Clarkson turned on him wasn't the reproachful glare that Thomas had expected. It was almost sorrowful.
We don't have the facilities for the necessary testing, he said gently. Or the time, even if we did, I expect. The saline solution will make up the missing volume. That may be enough.
Thomas shook his head.
No, we don't need to. I'm in the right group.
He dredged up the phrase Captain Linwood had used.
Universal donor. What? Clarkson demanded. They tested us at my old unit,
Thomas said, stumbling over his words. He explained about the transfusion scheme.
I didn't actually donate while I was there. They just started it before I left, but I was in the donor pool.
Major Clarkson looked at him speculatively. Have you seen it done before?
Yes, sir,
Thomas said, and forebode to mention that he'd been bleeding out at the time. Clarkson glanced down at Courtenay and up at the bottle of clear fluid that was draining into his veins.
Let's see how he does with the saline first, he said, and if that proves sufficient, there'll be no need to experiment.
As the saline dripped in, Major Clarkson examined Courtenay every few minutes, listening to his heart, measuring his blood pressure, peering at his gums for signs of cyanosis. After each of these checks, he shook his head. Finally, when the bottle was nearly empty, he said,
Are you absolutely certain about your blood group? Yes, sir, Thomas said, because if you're mistaken, a transfusion of the wrong blood group could kill him. I'm sure, Thomas said. At least I'm sure that Captain Linwood said I was in the donor group, and I'm sure he was careful about the testing. They did at least a few dozen transfusions while I was there, and I didn't hear of any mistakes. All right, Major Clarkson said. "Barker, bring me another intravenous kit and a large bore needle." Barker brought them. "What are you going to do, sir?" "I'm going," he said grimly, "to put some of Corporal Barrow's blood into Lieutenant Courtenay." "Blimey," said Barker. "Can you do that?" "We're about to find out." As he rigged up the IV kit so it would have a needle at each end, Major Clarkson said, "I expect you know one of the risks of this procedure is that it's difficult to tell exactly how much blood we're taking out of you?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "Captain Linwood would do about 20 minutes worth, but I'm not sure what size needle he used," he admitted. "You must say if you start to feel lightheaded." "Yes, sir." Noticing that Parker was watching wide-eyed as Major Clarkson stuck the needles into him and Lieutenant Courtenay in turn, Thomas told him, "I meant to get a cup of tea and a biscuit for this. Vital part of the process." Parker ran and got them. When Major Clarkson ended the transfusion, Courtenay remained very pale and still, but the Major assured Thomas that his heartbeat was more regular and the color of his gums promising. Thomas stayed with Courtenay the rest of the night. He wasn't sure he was meant to, suspected in fact that he was not, but nobody actually told him he was needed elsewhere. The last instruction Major Clarkson had given him was to rest after his blood loss, and no one could say he wasn't doing that. They'd brought a chair for Thomas to sit in while he was giving blood, and he dozed in that. Courtenay woke a bit before dawn. "What?" he said, lifting a hand to his face. Then, "Oh, damn." "It's all right, sir," Thomas said, blinking sleep out of his eyes. "You just rest." "Barrow?" Courtenay said. "Yes." Thomas took his hand on the pretext of examining the bandages on his arm. "Be careful not to pull the stitches." He groaned, but didn't pull his hand away from Thomas's, so I didn't even manage to top myself properly. Typical. "If it's any consolation, you came very close," Thomas told him. "I had to talk the Major into giving you a blood transfusion. First one ever done in this hospital." "I suppose it would be churlish of me to say you needn't have bothered." "It would," Thomas said, "and it's my blood he gave you, so mind you keep it where it belongs. If I wanted it on the floor, I'd put it there myself." "Yours?" Courtenay said, turning his head in Thomas's direction. "All right then, I suppose I'd better keep it." He drifted off. Early in the morning, they moved Courtenay back to his regular bed. To avoid gossip, said Sister Crawley, who had gotten wind of the night's events somehow and turned up first thing. Thomas decided not to point out that he'd woken the entire ward by yelling when he'd found him. Courtenay roused slightly while they moved him. "What? Barrow?" "I'm right here, sir." "Where are they taking me?" "Just back to your bed. Everything's been tidied up," he added. Someone had mopped up the blood and changed the bedding, presumably while Thomas had been napping in the other room. Once the orderlies who were carrying the stretcher put Courtenay on the bed, Thomas dismissed them. "I'll get him settled in, thanks." Once they had gone, Courtenay said, "What now? Will they still—" "They couldn't possibly." "Could they?" "I don't think so, sir," he said. "Just try to rest, all right?" By the time he'd fallen asleep, Major Clarkson and Sister Crawley had disappeared into Clarkson's office. Thomas, after making sure that Courtenay was really fast asleep and that there were no sharp objects in his reach, went there and knocked on the door. "Yes?" said Clarkson. "It's Corporal Barrow, sir." "Come in." Thomas went in. "Sir, Lieutenant Courtenay was wondering what's going to happen next." "We were just talking about that," Major Clarkson said, whipping him further into the room. Sister Crawley, apparently picking up a point she had been making before the interruption, said, "Many of the facilities for war neurosis are very good, not at all like one imagines." "He hasn't got a war neurosis," Major Clarkson rumbled. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Attempting suicide is a military offense." Thomas's stomach dropped into his boots. "Sir," Major Clarkson went on, "it's difficult to imagine anyone being cruel enough to make a point of it in the circumstances, but we shan't risk it. I'll put his name down for a specialist center for the blind. The waiting lists are very long. By the time they have a place for him, the marks will have faded." He eyed Thomas. "Does that suit you, Corporal?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said faintly. "Good," said Major Clarkson. "You look half dead. Get another cup of tea and go sleep in the prep room. Someone will wake you when we need you." "Yes, sir," he repeated. Thomas suspected he looked a good deal worse than he felt. With his coloring, all he had to do if he wanted to look ill was affect a listless expression, but he was feeling awfully drained.
which made sense, since he had been. He did as he was told, though he did stop and check on Courtenay on his way. Finding him resting comfortably, and enough staff at their posts to notice if anything went wrong, Thomas slept fairly well, since the stretcher bed where they'd had Courtenay in the prep room would have to be remade before the convoy anyway. There could be no reasonable objection to his sleeping on it, and it was a damn sight more comfortable than the chair where he'd spent the latter part of the night. As he slept, he was vaguely aware of the usual hospital business going on beyond the door, but nobody bothered him until the afternoon, when Nurse Crawley came in to wake him with a tray.
"I've brought you something to eat," she said. "We still have a couple of hours before the convoy."
"Thank you," Thomas said vaguely, sitting up. She put the tray on his lap, saying,
"It's gone a bit cold, I'm afraid, but the tea's hot."
It was boiled meat and potatoes, left from the patient's lunch, no doubt, and more than just a bit cold, but he was glad enough to have it. "If Carson knew you were bringing me a tray, he'd have a heart attack for real," he pointed out.
She's able to giggle. "He is a fusspot, isn't he? We'll take the secret to our graves."
Thomas supposed the difference between a fusspot and a tyrant could be one of perspective. Maybe. As Thomas ate, Nurse Crawley perched on the chair he'd sat in last night.
"They told me what happened with Lieutenant Courtenay. It must have been awful finding him like that."
"It was," Thomas said tersely and concentrated on chewing for a moment. "He's all right?"
She nodded. "I've just come from him. Dr. Clarkson gave him something to help him rest."
"Probably the best thing for him," Thomas noted.
"Dr. Clarkson was most anxious to make sure we know that he still doesn't agree about Lieutenant Courtenay," she added sardonically. "Even though he'll be staying now, apparently this distressing incident only shows that emotional involvement is no substitute for specialist care."
"If he says so," Thomas said.
She went on a bit condescendingly. "I expect he's not wrong, but if Lieutenant Courtenay was really confident in managing his condition, he'd not have been so distraught. And we'd only been working with him for a few days. It's not surprising we hadn't gotten that far yet."
Not wanting to contradict either her or Major Clarkson, Thomas made a noise of vague agreement. She continued,
"But then he started talking about how many of the patients would like to stay longer in a familiar place if only we had the room. And Cousin Isabel and I had the most marvelous idea."
"What's that?" Thomas asked warily.
"Downton." She went on to explain how they had heaps of rooms in which wounded officers could convalesce, and the hospital staff would be able to look in on them much more conveniently than at Farley Hall. "They can go up to the house when they're able to walk and don't need round-the-clock care, and then on to Farley Hall for the last few weeks of recuperation before the medical boards," she explained. "That way the ones who are nearly well and need only to gain strength can be as active as they like and not disturb the ones who need rest."
"Sounds very sensible," Thomas said, gulping his tea. "What do his lordship and her ladyship think of this plan?" He already knew what Carson would think of it. Nurse Crawley wilted a little.
"We haven't asked them yet," she admitted. "But surely they understand how beneficial it would be and how important it is for us to do our part. They must."
Thomas had considerable doubts about that, but said only, "You'd know better than I would." After a quick wash and brush up, Thomas went back on duty. Fortunately, the other orderlies had managed most of what needed to be done to prepare for the convoy, making up the beds, preparing trays with the materials for dressing changes, making sure all the instruments were sterilized and put away. The main things left to do were to set up the prep room. It needed disinfecting too, since they'd treated Courtenay in there, and the operating theater. They got those things finished in the nick of time, and Thomas had his orderlies out front waiting when the ambulances pulled up. It was their largest convoy yet, nearly 24 cases, most of them still in their uniforms from the battlefield. Many had field dressings on their wounds, suggesting they'd had no medical care beyond that basic first aid, and presumably the usual morphine and cigarettes on the journey. Thomas's job, as usual, was initial triage as they came off the ambulances, flagging those patients who should be seen by one of the medical officers right away. This was the first time in his experience at the Downton Hospital that the most seriously wounded patients weren't in that group. He sent two, an abdomen bloated with gas gangrene, and one poor bugger with only half a face, to beds in corners behind screens to be looked at when things slowed down. Rounding out the serious cases were a couple of raging infections, a head wound whom the ambulance orderly reported had been unconscious since he'd come off the boat, and one who'd had all 4 limbs blown off. what the orderlies at the Royal Orthopedic had called a basket case. The joke being that you didn't need a stretcher to carry one. A basket would do. Apart from those, they had the usual assortment of walking cases. Bullet holes and shrapnel wounds, missing limbs, and gas cases. All of them had to be settled into beds, be given baths and clean clothes, and have their dressings changed and their wounds examined. Somewhere in the middle of all that, Branson, of all people, wandered in carrying a picnic basket. Thomas supposed her ladyship must be behind it. Not even Branson would do something as gormless as that all on his own, but she certainly hadn't told him to stand around in the middle of everything jawing to Nurse Crawley. Thomas, on his way to dispose of some soiled bandages, made a slight detour to bring him by the pair. "Branson!" he snapped. "If you haven't any work of your own to do, you can hand out the tea and cigarettes." Branson opened his mouth to make some reply, but Thomas didn't stick around to hear it. One of the new orderlies was waving him over to look at what turned out to be a gangrenous foot. "You're right," Thomas told him. "One of the M.O.s had best have a look at that." On a more ordinary day, in fact, he'd have called one of them over immediately. As things were, it went on Major Clarkson's list of cases to see before he finished for the day. They were more or less run off their feet well into the evening. Thomas was in and out of the small ward, and usually managed to glance in Courtenay's direction on his way, but there wasn't a spare moment to speak with him, and him being blind, it wasn't as though Thomas could catch his eye to let him know he was taking notice of him. When it came time to hand out the supper trays, though, Thomas contrived to take Courtenay his. "Are you feeling any better, sir?" he asked, setting the tray across Courtenay's lap. Courtenay glanced at, or rather turned his head toward, the new patients to either side of him before saying unconvincingly, "Yes, quite well." Right, they could hardly talk as they had when the ward was half empty. "Good," he said heartily, and began orienting Courtenay to what was on his plate, again using the clock face system. "You've got a breaded cutlet at 6 o'clock. It goes from about 4 to 7:30. Then from 7:30 to midnight, boiled carrots." "Thank you, Barrow," Courtenay said, picking up his knife and fork with a slight wince. The movement must have pulled at his stitches. "Would you like me to cut it for you, sir?" Courtenay sighed. "Not particularly, but perhaps you had better." As Thomas did so, he said, "It seems I've managed to make things worse for myself." Thomas didn't quite know what to say to that and concentrated on cutting the cutlet into bite-sized pieces. "There you are, sir." Then another patient spilled a glass of milk on himself, allowing Thomas to make a speedy escape. A couple of hours later, they'd finally got the patients settled down to sleep, and the day shift was dismissed to their billets and their own dinners. Thomas was about ready for some dinner as well, but remembered belatedly that since he hadn't been back to the house, he also hadn't stopped by the kitchen for his usual packet of sandwiches. If he'd thought of it sooner, he could likely have scrounged something from the patients' suppers. It was brought over in dixies, much like how rations were taken to the front, and there was usually something left in them. But the dixies had already been taken back to the house of the women who cooked for the hospital. After seeing that the night shift knew what they were supposed to be doing, due to the large number of new cases, he had 2 orderlies and a VAD. He went over to the tea urn, hoping vaguely that there might be some biscuits lying around. There were no biscuits to be had, but half hidden behind a nest of unwashed cups and a box of standard-issue cigarettes, Thomas spotted Branson's picnic basket. If Nurse Crawley hadn't got around to eating its contents. She hadn't. Thomas happily polished off a wedge of game pie, a slab of Battenberg cake, and a couple of deviled quail's eggs. If anyone objected, or even noticed, he'd point out that it was unpatriotic to let food go to waste when there was a war on. Satisfied, he made another walk round the wards. The dying had been grouped together for convenience sake and were under the care of Nurse Bellamy. She was one of the new VADs, but had worked in a hospital in Manchester prior to being posted here, so she had things well in hand. "Poor Captain Haverford hasn't got much further to go, I don't think," she said, adjusting the pillow under the facial wound's head. Thomas nodded. The man's breathing was labored and very wet-sounding. "I shouldn't think so." The gas gangrene was resting comfortably enough. An empty hypodermic and a tray on the bedside table explained why. But the other, the more severe of the 2 raging infection cases, was restless with fever. His bedside table held a dish of water and a cloth. Nurse Bellamy had evidently been bathing him with cool water before deciding the facial wound's need was greater. Thomas went to pick up the task where she'd left off, but before he'd done more than wring out the cloth, she was taking it from him. "It's all right, Corporal. I can manage." He nodded and left her to it. The main ward had a few men tossing and turning sleeplessly. Thomas joined Parker in checking if they needed anything, and in bringing cigarettes and glasses of water to those that did. The small ward was quiet, but when Thomas walked by Courtenay's bed, the lieutenant lifted his head.
"It's Barrow, sir,"
he said softly. "Thought so," Courtenay said, letting his head drop back onto the pillow. It was the part of the evening when they often talked, but the bed Thomas sat on to do so was occupied now, and with the patients squeezed in as tightly as they were, they couldn't say anything they didn't want overheard. But Thomas had an idea.
"If you'd like to step out for a smoke, sir, I have a bit of time before I'll need to start on dressing changes."
He tried to make it sound for the benefit of any listeners as though this was a request Courtenay had made before, even though there was no reason he couldn't smoke in his bed. Fortunately, Courtenay caught on, or at least trusted him enough not to ask what the heck he was on about. "Yes, thanks. If it's warm enough for me to go in my dressing gown and slippers."
"It is, sir,"
Thomas said, helping Courtenay into them.
"Very fine night. There you are."
Courtenay took his arm and they walked outside, Thomas managing not to steer him into any walls or furniture.
"And the bench is just there if you take one step backwards."
Courtenay did so and sat. This was a good idea. I was starting to go a bit stir-crazy being in bed all day. Thomas lit 2 cigarettes and handed him one.
"Thought you might be,"
he said, sitting down next to him on the bench.
"Things should be a bit closer to normal tomorrow, now that the new patients are starting to settle in."
"Yes," Courtenay said. "Don't worry. Major Clarkson explained to me that you and Nurse Crawley would be too busy to give me the special attention I've gotten used to." His tone was slightly bitter. He wanted to make clear that having hysterics won't get me in my way. Thomas scoffed.
"Is that what he calls it?"
It seemed Courtenay and Nurse Crawley had gotten similar lectures. He wondered if Major Clarkson simply hadn't gotten around to him yet.
"You came very close,"
he said. If Thomas had found him even a few minutes later, or if he hadn't known about the blood groups, or if he hadn't been able to talk the Major into the blood transfusion. "I thought I must have." Courtenay took a long pull on his cigarette. Thomas watched the coal at the end flare brightly. "Blood transfusion's quite risky, isn't it?"
"Not if all the testing's been done in advance,"
Thomas said, and explained a bit about the blood grouping scheme at the 47th.
"But old Clarkson wouldn't have agreed to it if he'd thought you had much chance of pulling through without one. He's cautious when it comes to new methods."
"I suppose I'm very lucky," Courtenay said, not sounding at all convinced of it.
"You might be," Thomas said. "You can't know how things are going to turn out. But if you're dead, then there's no chance of anything coming out right."
He took a deep breath.
"When I was wounded, I thought I was going to die, and I was glad, just to have it all over with. I didn't know what I was going to do after the war. I still don't. And if I'd been killed, I wouldn't have to figure it out."
Next to him, Courtenay shifted his weight. "But now you're full of the joys of living, I suppose." Thomas took a long drag on his cigarette, thinking about the answer.
"Not hardly, but none of what's happened since then has been exactly unbearable, and some of it hasn't been too bad."
"Heavens," Courtenay said dryly. "You make it sound so enticing." Thomas laughed humorlessly.
"Yes, well."
He flicked away his cigarette end and lit another. Courtenay's was nearly done too.
"You want another one of these?"
"Yes, thanks." Once he had it, he said, "I suppose I think about spending the rest of my life as a dependent in my brother's house. Blind Uncle Edward who sits in a chair by the fire and talks about the war. I don't see how I can stand it."
"That's a tough one," Thomas agreed. "But if it does work out like that, and if you can't find a way to stand it, you can always top yourselves then."
That was what he told himself when he accidentally looked ahead into his own future and saw himself unable to find work, sleeping rough, or, worse yet, crawling back to Carson, begging to be allowed to work for his keep. It might not happen, and if it did, there was always one door that wouldn't be closed to him. Well, unless he hawked his razor to buy food or something. Courtenay let out a hollow chuckle. "That's a way of looking at it," he said.
"Maybe," Thomas said. "Even if it works out pretty badly, your brother gets the farm and all that. You could be blind Uncle Edward who spends all his time fishing and riding. You could even hunt. If life's not worth living without it. You might break your neck, but you'd be no worse off than if you'd died last night."
Courtenay's laugh at that was something closer to genuine. I don't mind the sound of that, he said. Not the neck-breaking part, necessarily. Thomas was glad to hear him add, but the rest of it, I'd be the terror of the county, he said. I'm not sure it would be fair to the rest of the hunt. I expect they'd feel they had to look out for me. Thomas hesitated, then said, You know, you won't be the only one. It was something they talked about at the Royal Orthopedic, to the limbless men especially. You couldn't hide cripples away in a corner by the fire when half the men of their generation were either crippled or dead. Every village and every city street would have its share, they'd said, and presumably every hunt club would as well. Maybe the only one blind, but I'd bet you anything by the time it's all over, men from your hunt would have lost arms or legs, or the use of them, or had their lungs gassed, their faces mutilated, and they'll want to get on with things too, as best they can. Could be you'll look out for one another. I hadn't thought of that, Courtenay admitted. But you're right. I was imagining everyone else picking up just where they left off, but, well, quite a lot of them are dead, but Meriwether was invalided out in Gilbert. Perhaps Shurston too by now. Rumor has it he cracked up, but he might have been wounded. He took a pull from his cigarette, nodding thoughtfully. I shouldn't mind so much poking along in the back with the children and old people, if some of my chums are there too. They finished their cigarettes and went back inside, Courtenay saying that he thought he just might be able to sleep now. Thomas got on with the dressing changes, slow going because he had one of the new men with him and had to explain what he was doing, and by the time he made it back into the small ward, Courtenay was asleep. And the facial wound was dead. Nurse Bellamy's other two patients were still hanging on, so Thomas and the new bloke, Griffiths, a former artilleryman who'd come back missing an eye, took charge of the laying out. You holding up all right? Thomas asked as they got on with it. Griffiths nodded. Yeah, half under his breath he added. I don't think I was worried this'd be a soft job. This was a bad one, as convoys go, Thomas said. Worst one I've seen here, as a matter of fact. On account of the push, I reckon, said Griffiths. Yeah. Here, help me turn him over. As they did so, Thomas continued, I'd guess the base hospitals in France are overrun and they shipped this lot across the channel without doing much more than checking they were still breathing. You often get one or two that took a turn for the worse on the journey, but usually they go through a couple of rounds of triage before they make it this far, and we mostly get ones that have a chance. Out of this group, they'd probably lose a few more, besides the ones already on death watch, as filthy as most of the wounds had been when the convoy arrived. If we're really lucky, they've even been tidied up a bit before we get them. Good, said Griffiths. That smell takes you right back to the trenches, doesn't it? After that laying out, there was another one to do, and then a medication round, and so on until the patients started waking up, and then the day shift started trickling in. Nurse Crawley was one of the first to arrive, and once Thomas had updated her on Lieutenant Courtenay, he'd slept the rest of the night through, she said, I think Mamma and Papa are going to agree about the convalescito. Thomas let his surprise show, and she added, Mamma wasn't keen at first, but then Granny said that she forbade it. That's when Mamma started to really consider it. Now that Thomas could believe. After reporting interests to Crawley, Thomas made his way up the hill to the house. As he walked, he wondered idly whether Lang had been sacked in his absence. Thomas had barely spared a thought for him since finding out Courtenay was being sent away, let alone finding him half dead. Well, either Bates had taken the matter in hand or he hadn't. Thomas couldn't be expected to handle everything. When Thomas stepped into the house, he heard roars of laughter coming from the servants' hall. Not at all a usual occurrence. Wondering what could be going on, he made his way down the passage and found William sitting at the table, dressed in the cleanest infantry uniform Thomas had ever seen, saying, So he says, I think it's dead, Cole, while most of the staff stood around him as if spellbound. Except for Lang, who sat at the far end of the table, looking down intently at a newspaper. What are you doing here? Thomas asked. William jumped to his feet and braced up. Oh, for pity's sake. As you were. As William sat down again, Daisy explained. He had a weekend pass from training, and he stopped to see us on his way back. He sees some of them more than others, Thomas would wager. How nice. Anna added, He's getting the train right after breakfast. I'm sure you can manage to be nice for that long. We'll see, Thomas said and circled round the table to take his usual place. William, it turned out, had been entertaining them all with amusing anecdotes of training camp life. The one Thomas had interrupted had been about bayonet drill, and he wasted no time in launching into one about an inspection parade before the camp commander. Out of the corner of his eye, Thomas gave him a once-over, and when William paused for breath, said, "Speaking of all that, you're going to want to button your top pocket." All eyes turned to look at him. "Sometime before you get back," he added. Blushing furiously, William buttoned it. "Only trying to help," Thomas lied. Before anyone could challenge him on this point, Miss Patmore appeared and told Daisy to stop mooning about and go get the toast. The crowd around William's chair broke up, and as they took their seats, Bates asked Thomas, "Was that really necessary?" Thomas shrugged slightly. Honestly, he'd come back from actually being at war, and they all looked at him like an insect under a microscope. William came back from Richmond, and they hung on his every word. "I was always very good at inspections." Anna and Bates exchanged a look and apparently decided to let it go.
"Have you been down at the hospital all this time?" she asked. "Lady Sybil said something about an emergency."
Thomas was a little surprised anyone had noticed his absence, especially with William there to fawn over. "Yes, one of the patients needed a blood transfusion, which made for a hectic night. They needed me back early the next day, yesterday, for the convoy coming in the afternoon, and—" He was cut off by Carson and Miss Hughes making their entrance and everyone standing up. As they sat back down again, he continued, "And I ended up just sleeping down there, because it was my blood they used, and I was a bit worn out." The scrape of chairs died down just as Thomas got to the end of his explanation, and Carson glared at him. "I'm not sure we need to be hearing about blood at the breakfast table. There are women present." Anna and Ethel exchanged a wry look, and Thomas it go around the table from woman to woman. What precisely it signified he didn't know. When it reached Miss Hughes, she said,
"I think we can manage. Used your blood for what?"
With a wary glance at Carson, Thomas said, "A transfusion for one of the patients. It was the first one Major Clarkson had done, but I'd already been identified as a suitable donor in France, and that's the trickiest bit."
"What did you have to do?"
Ethel asked. "Just sit there and bleed into a tube," Thomas answered. "It's not difficult, not very painful. It just makes you a bit tired."
Daisy, bringing the teapot, asked, "Ain't it dangerous? What if they take too much out of you?"
"Well, that's what the doctor doing it has to watch out for," Thomas said.
"I don't think I dare," Daisy said. "Wouldn't you do it to save someone's life?" Ethel asked. "I think I would." Anna added, "If someone was dying and they asked you, I don't see how you could say no."
Carson harumphed, and Miss Hughes said only, "Nor do I," before shifting the conversation to another topic. After breakfast was finished, most of the household dispersed, some to their duties, some to see William off. Soon Thomas and Lang were the only ones left. Carson had gone up to serve in the breakfast room, demonstrating that Lang was still in the doghouse, even if he hadn't been sacked. Thomas went round the table to sit by him. "Holding up all right?" he asked, lighting a cigarette. Lang waved off his offer of one. "Yes. Mr. Bates told me about your suggestion, but Mr. Carson has agreed to give me another chance. I just need to keep my mind on what I'm doing." Easier said than done, but that was Lang's choice. "All right," he said. "I wouldn't like it much either, going that far down the ladder, but I thought it might be something to consider if you're in a tight spot." "It was kind of you to think of me," Lang said, "but I'll manage. I must." Lang turned his head toward the door as voices were raised in farewell, then looked back at Thomas. "That boy," he said, swallowing hard, "has no idea what he's in for." "I know," said Thomas. "I tried to tell him, but I might as well have saved me breath to call him a porridge." "Yes," Lang said dryly. "Me as well. If I'd known he was coming, I'd have told you not to bother." Thomas had much enjoyed dredging up things better off not thought of in a futile effort to give William some warning. And he wasn't shell-shocked, though I suppose there was always a chance he believed someone who wasn't me. "At least you were sent home for a real wound," Lang said morosely. "You might be a—" Thomas watched him give up on finding a word for it that he could say in a respectable house, and he continued, "But not a coward." "Nor are you," Thomas said. "Once he's been there, if he's lucky enough to come back, he'll know better." Lang shook his head. "Some come through it all right. You did." Thomas hesitated. Well, he'd already said it out loud once, and the world hadn't ended. "I didn't much care whether I lived or died." He could say that much.
He couldn't say, "I still don't."
So that made it a lot easier. My mates thought I was fearless, but it was just that the worst thing that could happen to me already had.
Lang started to ask what. Thomas hadn't considered how much detail Bates or whoever else had gone into explaining to Lang about him, and he wondered if he would have to explain, but Lang cut the question off short and said,
"Oh. Yeah," Thomas said. "The way I see it, everybody's got a breaking point. Some place where if you get hit there, you just shatter."
He thought about the Kingston matter, and how Rouse hadn't cared much about getting FP, but months earlier he thought it ought to bother Thomas that he'd left a dying man in no man's land to bring in one that had a chance.
You might shrug off something that would break the next bloke, and you might shrug off the thing that would break you. And it's mostly luck, whether you get hit in your own weak spot or somebody else's." "I suppose," Lang said doubtfully. "I couldn't do what you do. Look, every day, at men who've been torn to pieces, and then they come back here and act as though everything were normal."
"The second part's not always easy," Thomas admitted.
"The things they care about in this house. But I wouldn't trade jobs with you for a gold clock. I'd look at any number of gory ruins before I'd wait at table under Mr. Carson with my shoulder the way it is."
Lang opened his mouth to ask something, but there were voices coming down the passage, which resolved into Bates's saying something Thomas couldn't quite catch, and Anna's saying, "Don't know, but I expect we'll soon find out."
"His lordship seems pretty resigned to it,"
Bates answered as they came in.
"Thomas, before I get, his lordship said he sent a note to Cutler to give you everything you need."
Cutler was the gamekeeper. It took Thomas a moment to remember what business he might possibly have with him.
"Right, thanks,"
Thomas said and explained.
"One of the patients wants to go fishing. Nurse Crawley and I thought we'd try to arrange it."
"That was kind of you,"
Bates said. A little suspiciously, Thomas thought. Anna said quickly, "But the main thing we were wondering about was this business about turning us into a convalescent home. I expect you've heard something about it."
"A bit,"
Thomas said.
"The idea is that the patients from the hospital will come up here once they don't need quite so much care. We've been sending them to Farley Hall, but it's so far away."
"Lady Sybil said that," Anna said. "But what difference does it make how far away it is?" Thomas had to think about that for a moment. The difference, in Courtenay's case, was that Thomas and Nurse Crawley weren't at Farley Hall, but he could hardly say that.
"It can be disruptive, moving them to a completely new place when they've just started to feel better," he temporized. "If it's closer, the same staff can work in both places, so it's less of an adjustment, and," he asked, realizing something, "the War Office is pressuring us to move patients along faster to free up beds in the hospital. There's only so much of that we can do before Farley Hall runs out of places too. I expect they'll need another convalescent home in the area no matter what, and being so near the hospital makes Downton the first choice."
"But how will it work?" Anna asked. "Will we be expected to help look after the patients?"
"I'm not sure," Thomas admitted. "I expect the War Office will have to send us more orderlies or VADs or something for the skilled nursing duties. As for the rest of it, Nurse Crawley said that her ladyship is discussing it with Major Clarkson later today. Between the lot of us, it likely won't be long before we find out what they said."
"Naturally," Miss Crawley chirped. "Dr. Clarkson will be in overall charge, but I expect the day-to-day operations would be handled by a matron." Her expression left no doubt as to whom she thought that matron would be. Turning his attention to Lady Grantham, Clarkson saw that she had had the same understanding and didn't like it one bit.
"We'll have to see what the War Office is willing to send us in the way of personnel,"
he said, hoping to at least forestall the argument for another time, preferably a time when the plans for the convalescent home were far too advanced for Lady Grantham to back out.
"But I agree it's not at all likely they'll be able to supply a medical officer to take charge, nor do we especially need one. The officers being treated there will need some skilled nursing care, but most of their needs will be of the sort that a grand house is accustomed to supplying for its guests."
He hoped that Lady Grantham would be mollified by the suggestion that her role as hostess would be equal to Miss Crawley's as matron, but her lips narrowed. "We're already making to with fewer servants than we're used to. I'm not certain how much extra work we can reasonably ask of them." Mentally shifting tracks, Carson said,
"Indeed, in these cases, the War Office usually provides funds for workers to be hired locally. Cooks, laundresses, and so forth. In cases where duties overlap, it may be best for them to work side by side with your existing staff, but the exact details can be worked out as we move forward."
Fortunately, Lady Grantham accepted this explanation, and they moved on to discussing such matters as how many cases the convalescent home might reasonably accommodate, Miss Crawley arguing for a somewhat higher number than Clarkson had in mind, and when the convalescent home might begin operations. After another quarter hour of negotiations, Miss Crawley said, "Well then, I expect Dr. Clarkson has a great deal to discuss with the War Office, and I must get on with supervising the dressing changes." She stood up, and Clarkson rose as well, but Lady Grantham only murmured,
"Don't let me keep you."
Miss Crawley missed the significance of this and sailed out. Clarkson, more observant, circled round the desk to close the door behind her and waited for Lady Grantham to say what she had lingered to say.
"Dr. Clarkson," she said, her voice very level, "I do want to help the war effort."
Clarkson half expected that the next thing she'd say would be something like,
"But not in this way." What she actually said was something of a relief. "But we will need to be sure that whomever is selected as matron, or whatever it is, understands that Downton is our home, and that it is our choice to open it to the wounded officers."
Clarkson had spent enough time dealing with the upper classes to grasp what she wasn't saying, that she didn't want Miss Crawley taking charge of her house. "I quite agree," he said, "arranging things so that everyone is comfortable, the patients and the family, the convalescent home staff and the servants, is a challenging and delicate task."
"I couldn't have put it better myself," Lady Grantham said. "That's precisely what we want, for everyone to be comfortable."
"The difficulty is that hospital matrons are in short supply and high demand. That was, after all, why he had to put up with Miss Crawley himself. It's possible that the War Office might allocate us one, but we certainly cannot hope to receive a selection of candidates from which to choose, and the typical hospital matron is quite accustomed to having her own way. In other words, whomever the War Office sent could easily be even worse than Miss Crawley." Clarkson hoped that Lady Grantham would be persuaded to opt for the devil she knew.
"I see," Lady Grantham said, "but I'm not sure how we can move forward without the right person in the role."
In other words, Miss Crawley, as matron, was a deal-breaker. Clarkson saw his plans for the convalescent home going up in smoke unless he could come up with a solution. He briefly considered whether Nurse Wibley could possibly manage. It wasn't as though they'd be doing complicated treatments there. But no, Miss Crawley and Lady Sybil would both resist that proposal, and with good reason. Could Lady Sybil... No, definitely not. She was far too inexperienced.
Although perhaps that was the solution Lady Grantham was angling for?
Testing the waters, he said, "It would have to be someone with substantial experience, both in nursing and in supervising others."
"Of course," said Lady Grantham.
Clarkson waited for a long moment for the but or an although, but when none came, he concluded that she was not picturing her youngest daughter as matron of the convalescent home. With an inward sigh, Clarkson realized that the solution was, as Miss Crawley had said yesterday of the choice of convalescent home site, staring him right in the face. Someone with experience in ward work and supervision, up for a challenging yet delicate job, able to train the raft of new personnel they'd be getting, and knowing something of the routines of a great house wouldn't hurt either. "Wardmaster!" Thomas said, picking his jaw up off the floor. When Nurse Crawley had told him that Major Clarkson wanted to see him immediately, he just arrived at the hospital and had been on his way to tell Lieutenant Courtenay that the fishing expedition was all arranged, if he felt up to it. Thomas's first thought was that he must be in some sort of trouble. Halfway to the Major's office, it had occurred to him that he might be about to be officially told of the convalescent home plans. "Yes," said Major Clarkson. "You'll have to be made up to sergeant, of course, but I don't foresee any difficulty with that." "Yes, sir," Thomas said automatically. "Wardmaster, fact me mind." "What about my duties here?" Sister Crawley would be matron, of course. He didn't see how the hospital could manage without both of them. "You'd concentrate on the convalescent home," Major Clarkson said. "The acting ward sister would resume the day-to-day supervision of the orderlies. With the extra training you've given Franklin, Booth, and Henson, they and Nurse Bellamy should be able to handle the most complicated nursing duties. We'll have to train at least one of them to assist in theater, but that's not a serious obstacle." Thomas barely heard anything after the part about Sister Crawley. She was going to murder him. "Sir," he said, "speaking of Sister Crawley, I'd have thought she'd be the one to be in charge of things at Downton." "So does she," Major Clarkson said. "But when Lady Grantham and I discussed the special requirements of the position, we agreed that you were the best choice. For one thing, the person in charge will need to coordinate the hospital routines with the household ones, giving equal importance to both. In other words, her ladyship didn't want Sister Crawley running roughshod over the house. I understand, sir. He hesitated. I have the impression that Sister Crawley feels strongly about the project. What are we going to do to stop her murdering me? I have that impression as well, said Major Clarkson. I hope she'll understand that we need her here. So he was aware of the problem, but had no ideas other than hoping for the best. Fortunately, Thomas did. As it happens, sir, I had a thought earlier today about something that might suit the ward sister's talents if she had enough time to take it on. He hadn't realized when he thought it up that it would solve two problems at once, but it seemed an auspicious start for his new role as ward master, if he could make it work. Major Clarkson looked interested. What's that? Now that we've seen how useful it can be to have a blood donor on hand, I wondered if it wouldn't be useful to identify some more here in the village. Thomas explained. I admit I have no idea how the testing works on the technical side, but surely the first steps would be to educate the public about how transfusions can save lives and persuade them to be tested. That part seems right up the ward sister's alley, if you don't mind my saying. Indeed, said Major Clarkson, sitting back in his chair. But do you suppose enough people would step forward to make it worthwhile? We'd have to test a great many to get a sufficient pool of potential donors. Well, sir, the reason I thought of it was that we were talking about it in the servants' hall. They wondered why they didn't see me yesterday, and I knew I oughtn't say anything about the particular case. A few spoke of how they'd be willing to do it to save someone's life, particularly the women. Major Clarkson said, frowning. I suppose it's a way they can contribute with all the men laying their lives on the line, Thomas offered. So that's when I started to think about it, and I didn't really think it was my place to suggest, but if the ward sister is keen to take on even more responsibility... When isn't she? Major Clarkson asked rhetorically. It's an interesting idea, Barrow. Thank you, sir. Encouraged, he went on. All the committee work the ward sister does would give her the opportunity to present the idea to various groups, drum up support. It calls for someone with a bit of standing in the community. Put it to her that way, and she couldn't possibly suggest it would be better for her to run the convalescent home and Thomas do the blood grouping scheme. I just have to find out more about the technical side as well, the major said. But it does seem worth looking into. Let's not say anything to the ward sister just yet. About this or the other thing, Thomas hoped. Yes, sir. They went on to talk more about the convalescent home plans. Fortunately, the next few steps all involved arranging things with the War Office, and so were Major Clarkson's responsibility, which would give Thomas a bit of time to get his head round his side of things. When the meeting finished, he had just a few minutes to stop by and speak to Lieutenant Courtenay before his duty shift began. He found Courtenay sitting outside with Nurse Crawley. Thomas hesitated to approach them. It had occurred to him that Courtenay could be a viable alternative to whatever unsuitable person she had previously fancied herself in love with, but she waved him over, saying to Courtenay, Here's Corporal Barrow now. Sir, nurse, he greeted them. Courtenay didn't look too bad, he thought, not quite so pale and sitting up and taking an interest in things. The walking cane was propped up next to him against the bench the two of them were sitting on. I hope what Dr. Clarkson wanted wasn't anything too dire, Nurse Crawley said. No, Thomas said. He wanted to talk about the convalescent home plans. Oh, good, she said. Cousin Isabel filled me in earlier. It really does look as though it's going to come off. To Courtenay, she added brightly, So something positive has already come of all this. The first of many things, I'm sure. Thomas went to exchange a wry look with Courtenay, but of course he couldn't see it. Speaking of things to look forward to, everything's arranged for fishing on Thursday, if you feel up to it. He told the gamekeeper that the patient in question had had a minor relapse and might have to postpone, but he hoped Courtenay would still want to go. By the time Thomas's next afternoon off came round, there was no telling whether he'd be too busy to take it. Oh, you must go, Nurse Crawley said. I'm sure it's the best thing for you, being out in the open air and everything. Well, if I must, Courtenay said with a mock sigh. Thomas was heartened to see a faint smile on his face. But the question was he pleased by Nurse Crawley's solicitude or the prospect of spending time with Thomas? This gentleman Thomas is going fishing with, Mr. Bates said as they worked side by side in the boot room. Is he... that is it... I'm not sure, Anna said. She had wondered too. Lady Sybil is fond of him too.
She thought of the letters she'd seen back before Thomas had gone to war from the Duke of Crowborough.
But Lady Sybil isn't going with them.
No, she's on duty at the hospital. Anna buffed the toe of a walking shoe. I'm sure he'll be careful.
I hope so,
Mr. Bates said.
I was glad to find out it wasn't like that with him and Henry. Between the army and Mr. Carson, I'd say the army's more likely to look the other way.
Privately, Anna agreed. I don't know why Mr. Carson can't just accept it like the rest of us have.
Well, if he doesn't like anything irregular,
Mr. Bates pointed out.
But it isn't as though Thomas was particularly obvious, apart from the matter with Mr. Fitzroy at least. I doubt I'd have known if Mr. Carson hadn't tipped me off when I first came to the house.
Anna frowned. I'm surprised he'd speak of it.
He didn't come right out and say it,
Mr. Bates explained.
It was something about reporting it to him if Thomas tried anything.
That seemed more in keeping with Mr. Carson's character, but even so, Anna wondered why he'd chosen to face facts even that much, when he could have simply pretended not to notice.
So we've got a couple of choices,
Thomas said as he and Lieutenant Courtenay walked up the drive toward the gamekeeper's lodge. They were walking arm in arm, which Thomas felt a bit self-conscious about, though anyone who looked closely would surely see that it was only because Courtenay was blind.
The best fishing is in the stream, and the gamekeeper told me about a spot that's fairly open and not too difficult to get to, but there are a couple of tricky bits on the way there, and some trees and things to get the lines tangled in.
It was, in fact, the spot they used when the fishing party included ladies, rather than one the gamekeeper would recommend for serious anglers, but Thomas didn't think it was necessary to mention that.
Or there's the ornamental lake, which is rumoured to have fish in it somewhere. There's a gravel path the whole way there, and we can go out on a rowboat and just drop the lines in.
Courtenay said. I think I'd rather try the stream. I've never been much for messing about in boats, and a stream is what we have at home. So if the point is to find out whether I'll be able to fish at home, if you don't mind, of course.
Yes, sir, Thomas said. I wasn't all that keen on rowing the boat, to be honest. Never done it before.
Definitely the stream, then, Courtenay said. It's a bit too cold for a swim. They stopped at the gamekeeper's lodge to collect the fishing gear. Thomas had been by earlier for a quick lesson in stringing hooks and so forth, and set off into the grounds. As they walked, Thomas described the sights to the best of his ability.
Up here's one of the follies, he said, supposed to look like an ancient Greek ruin. Or Roman. Which one has the arches?
Roman, I think, Courtenay said. The Greeks had columns and triangles.
Well, it's got columns too,
Thomas said doubtfully. They might have both done columns, Courtenay said. I don't remember. Not particularly promising. It seemed to Thomas that a queer who'd been to Oxford would probably know a fair bit about the ancient Greeks.
Well, whichever it is, it's up ahead on the left. Some vines growing around the columns with pink flowers on. I'm not sure if those are supposed to be there. The gardener's an old chap, so he's still around, but his assistants have been called up.
They chatted as they went across the formal garden and through the yew walk, but after that came a field and a copse, which required all of Thomas's and Courtenay's attention to keep him from tripping over hummocks and tree roots and things. At last they reached the stream bank, an open grassy spot with a few wildflowers blooming. Noticing that Courtenay looked a bit piqued, Thomas said,
I'm a bit out of condition for field marches. How about we sit and have a smoke before we start the fishing?
Courtenay agreed, and Thomas selected a good spot for them to sit down on. Hope springing eternal, he lit both cigarettes and passed one to Courtenay. If the gesture meant anything to him, he didn't let on. Thanks, he said, stretching his legs out in front of him. Listen to that. Thomas listened. He didn't hear anything in particular.
The stream?
He hazarded. Yes, Courtenay said. The stream, the birds, and the no bloody guns. Oh, right. Back in England for the better part of a year, Thomas had stopped noticing the silence of the guns.
They had me at a base hospital on the Channel for a while, after I got my wound, he said. It wasn't until I went for a walk one day that I realized what I'd been hearing the whole time was the ocean, and not the guns.
Sounds about right, Courtenay said. The things we got used to over there. Thomas nodded soberly, then said,
Yeah,
when he remembered Courtenay couldn't see him. They finished their cigarettes and went to stand on the edge of the stream. Thomas had naively thought that they'd begin by casting fishing lines into the water, but it turned out that the first step was what Courtenay called reading the stream, which meant examining it with an eye to where fish were most likely to choose to be, shaded areas, deeper spots, and so on. The shady places weren't too hard for Thomas to find, but since he'd never before given a moment's thought to how to tell which part of a stream was deep, and for Courtenay the process was so automatic as to require little or no conscious thought, it took them a while to get it worked out. By that time, Thomas would not have minded another cigarette, but Courtenay was keen to get started, so Thomas moved on to baiting the hooks. Cutler the gamekeeper had supplied him with a tin full of worms, and discussing with Courtenay where he ought to stand to cast his line. The difficulty there was that the same trees and brush that produced the shade that fish apparently liked also provided obstacles for the line to get caught in. Finally, they settled on a clear stretch of bank that would allow Courtenay to, in theory at least, drop his line into a section shaded by a tree on the opposite bank. Courtenay cast the line, and it landed in the water with a satisfying plunk, right in the shallow, sunlit middle of the stream. "Where did I put it?" he asked. Thomas considered whether to lie to him or not. Courtenay sighed and started reeling in the line. "This won't work if I can't trust you to tell me what I can't see," he said angrily.
"Yes, sir," Thomas said quickly. "Of course. You were about 10 or 15 feet short, and if the spot we talked about was at 12 o'clock, you were at about 1:30.
"Thank you," said Courtenay, his voice still sharp. As he finished reeling in the line, he said, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have snapped at you."
"It's all right," Thomas said, because he had to. "Would you like to try again?"
"Yes. Have I still got the bait on the hook?" Thomas checked.
"Yes."
"And you're still standing well over to my left. The last thing we need is for you to catch a fishing hook in the eye."
"That would be unfortunate,"
Thomas admitted, taking another step to Courtenay's left.
"I believe I'm well clear."
Courtenay cast again, this time overshooting the mark and catching the hook in a bush at about 10 o'clock. Thomas wondered if he was going to have to wade across to untangle it, but Courtenay managed to pull it free, though he lost the worm in the process. On the third try, he got it more or less in the place he wanted. The line had gone in right at the edge of the shaded spot, but upstream. "That's all right, then," Courtenay said, though he was still reeling the line in. "The current will carry the bait downstream a bit."
"Then why are you reeling it in?"
Thomas asked, adding a belated,
"Sir."
"Taking up the slack in the line," Courtenay explained, turning his head toward Thomas. "Haven't you fished before?"
"No,"
Thomas said. He supposed working-class blokes might fish in the countryside, but they certainly didn't in Sheffield. "No wonder it's like the blind leading the blind here," he said. "Well, the next bit is to watch the cork. Tell me when it gets out of the shady place or close to anything that might tangle the line."
"I expect I can manage that,"
Thomas said, and lit a cigarette. In due course, the cork drifted into the sun, and Courtenay reeled in the line and cast again. This time, it only took him 2 tries to get it into the spot he'd selected, or near enough to be getting on with. And what's more, he got a bite, although Courtenay pronounced the fish too small to keep and instructed Thomas to put it back in the water. He elected to try a more challenging spot next, and this time did get the line hopelessly entangled in a tree, though fortunately one on this side of the stream. "I'll pull it down as far as it can, and you cut it off," Courtenay instructed. I hope the gamekeeper gave you some extra hooks and corks." He had, although Thomas had forgotten the finer points of what he'd explained about how to attach them. Thomas managed to get them attached in a way that seemed as though it wouldn't fall off, at least, even if it didn't look quite right. After a couple more tries, Courtenay got his line into the selected spot and took up a resting stance on the bank. They talked a bit about Courtenay's home and the horse he'd had before the war. It had been a wrench, Thomas gathered, when the government requisitioned it, and then the hospital and the people there. "Do you happen to know what made Nurse Crawley decide to take up nursing? It isn't exactly what one would expect of an earl's daughter."
Ignoring the slight sinking in his stomach, Thomas said, "I was still in France when she decided to start, but I gather she wanted to do something important for the war effort. I believe it was Sister Crawley who suggested nursing in particular."
"Ah," said Courtenay, reeling in a bit of slack on his line. "I've heard of girls taking it up after a fiancé's been killed." "So it was Nurse Crawley, Lady Sybil, that he wanted."
"Of course it was." "I don't think it was like that in her case. She came out just before the war, and I never heard anything about an understanding, much less a formal engagement."
"I just wondered," Courtenay added quickly.
"She's a very diligent nurse,"
Thomas said, because he had to say something.
A while later, after catching a fish big enough to keep, Courtenay proclaimed that his arms were getting sore and persuaded Thomas to have a go at fishing. "It is your day off," he said. "It's hardly fair for me to have all the fun." Thomas was not entirely sure how making an idiot of himself with a fishing rod would add to the fun of the occasion, but he could hardly say so, especially since he'd been taking some pains to downplay Courtenay's mistakes. Fishing, it turned out, was a great deal more difficult than it looked. On his first try, he didn't swing the rod nearly hard enough, and the line barely cleared the bank they were standing on. The next, he overcorrected and caught a section of bank on the opposite side. On his third attempt, he caught the bush to his left, and on the fourth one to his right. "I'm not sure I'm cut out for this," he said as he rebaited the hook. "You're not, doing it badly to make me feel better?" Courtenay asked. "No," Thomas said grimly. His fifth cast landed with another satisfying plunk in the middle of the stream, not far off from where Courtenay's first unsatisfactory one had ended up, if Thomas remembered correctly. "That sounded better," Courtenay said encouragingly. "Well, it's in the water," Thomas said. "That might be the best I'm going to do." "It's my fault," Courtenay said. "I'd be able to tell you what to do differently if I could just see what you were doing." "Bloody hell, he could hardly give up now, could he?" "We'll figure it out," he said, determinedly cheerful, and began reeling the line. "I'm not bad at cricket. How much harder can this be?" "Oh," said Courtenay in a tone of one to whom all has been revealed. "Are you trying to bowl it?" Courtenay's tone made clear he shouldn't have been, and Thomas lied. "No," reflexively, recalling what Courtenay had said about needing to trust him, forced himself to correct himself. "Well, maybe. Sort of." After another explanation of casting technique, this one focused on the differences between casting a fishing line and bowling a cricket ball, Thomas found himself putting the line somewhere near to where he wanted it on close to half of his attempts. For another hour or so, they took turns fishing. The only one Thomas caught was too small to keep, though he was privately proud of himself for managing it at all, and Courtenay got another keeper, as he put it. "I don't know about you," he said, "but I'm getting hungry." "Oh," Thomas said flatly. Now that he thought about it, every previous time he'd been present while fishing was taking place, there had been a meal involved. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have thought about bringing a picnic tea, but I didn't." "Don't be silly," Courtenay said. "We've got our tea right here." He lifted the basket they'd put the fish into. "We just need to find some wood." Thomas was not quite ignorant enough of country sports to miss his meaning. "I should probably mention I've never cleaned a fish before either, nor cooked anything over an open fire." "That's all right," Courtenay said. "My brother and I always used to cook and eat our catch when we were boys. It's not difficult." Thomas would have begged to differ once they got started gutting the fish, but was too busy trying to stop Courtenay from taking the knife without actually saying that Major Clarkson would murder him if he brought Courtenay back with fewer fingers than he'd started out with. But lashing the fish to green twigs was something Courtenay could do by feel, and starting a campfire was similar enough in principle to lighting a fireplace that Thomas managed that part of it without too much trouble. As they worked, Courtenay talked about those childhood fishing expeditions with his brother. "We'd pretend that we were Red Indians, or else Robin Hood and his merry men, living off the land, you know. But we'd always end up arguing over whether Robin Hood fished or not. I thought he must have done, even though the stories don't mention it. So if we felt like keeping the peace, we played Indians. My Indian name was Walks in the Forest Without a Sound. Jack was always changing his, trying to sound fierce, take spenny scalps and rubbish like that." Thomas tried to remember what games he and Alice and Jamie had played. They must have played something, but he couldn't remember anything in particular. "I used to pretend my real father was an Italian count," he said, skipping over the fact that he'd been much too old for childish games when he'd pretended that. "Well, now I'm going to imagine that you look Italian," Courtenay said. "Do you?" "Not really," Thomas said. "I have dark hair." He got up to turn the fish on the improvised spits. "How do you tell if these are done?" "Mostly you don't," Courtenay answered. "Eating them burnt or half raw is part of the fun." Of the two, Thomas decided he would prefer burnt. "Let's give them a few more minutes." Courtenay settled down on his elbow. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Only you must tell me the truth." "Now you're worrying me," Thomas said, only half joking, even though the question couldn't possibly be, "Is it true you're a poof?"
Just how dreadful do I look?
That wasn't what Thomas had been expecting at all. He hesitated, trying to sort out how a normal man would answer a question like that. Certainly not, "You look lovely," or "better than you have any right to." He hesitated too long.
Bad enough to make women faint and children cry, then. Right.
Courtney's voice was brittle.
No,
Thomas said quickly.
you don't look bad at all, really. There's a bit of scarring around your eyes, but nothing too terrible. It's faded a lot since the bandages came off. By the time it's finished, you'll have to look closely to see it.
Well, it wouldn't be Courtney looking closely, but Thomas didn't suppose he had to clarify that.
What about my eyes themselves?
They're fine.
Lovely, actually. A soft grey that reminded Thomas of kittens. Really? There was this blind man in our village. His eyes were sort of yellowish white like grubs. They're not like that?
No, Thomas said. Nothing like that.
You're not having me on?
Courtney asked warily.
I'm not. Ask anyone. Ask Nurse Crawley.
Thomas congratulated himself on managing to keep any hint of bitterness from his tone.
I did, Courtney admitted, but I thought you might be trying to spare my feelings.
Well, I never do that. A touch of bitterness might have crept out then.
No, said Courtney. I don't suppose you would. That's what I like about you. Nurse Crawley's lovely. I mean, everyone at the hospital's been very kind. But they're all so cheerful. As well being blind for the rest of my life is like having it rain when I planned a picnic. You're not afraid to admit that nothing's ever gonna be the same. That's the only reason I can even try to believe you when you say it might not be as bad as I think.
Thomas knew it was small and petty of him to be warmed by hearing himself compared to Lady Sybil and come out on top, even if only in one way. But he was warmed by it.
I'm not sure anyone ever said they like me for my cynicism before.
Really? It's one of your best... Are the fish burning?
They were. Thomas quickly pulled them off the fire.
It's just the tail ends that are burnt, he reported. The rest is just the bit of it done.
They ate the burning hot fish with their fingers since they'd brought no cutlery. The tail ends were burnt, the head ends leathery, but there were a couple of bites in the middle, the thickest part, that were just about perfect. It was, Thomas thought, a better result than they had any right to expect.